Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Knight's Dilemma, Armor in the Desert Winds. The desert is not a forgiving place. At dawn, the sun barely peeks over distant dunes, yet the air already carries a weight that presses against your chest, thick with heat and anticipation. For a medieval knight accustomed to the cold stone halls of Europe, the first march across sand feels like walking into an entirely different world, one where every element conspires against you. The steel that once offered protection becomes both a shield and a burden, the fine mail clinking with every step, holding in heat, and collecting the abrasive particles that the wind tirelessly drives through every seam. You have risen before sunrise to prepare your armor, as knights always do. Each piece, polished and heavy, is lifted carefully from the saddle or the ground. The chainmail, a dense weave of iron rings, is already warm from the sun rising over the horizon. Gauntlets, greaves, cuirass, helmet. Each element weighs down your body differently than it would on the cool, hard-packed roads of your homeland. Every strap is fastened just so, ensuring that the armor will hold through hours of movement, yet not so tight as to cut circulation. The desert offers no leniency for errors. Armorers from Acre or Damascus have labored over pieces like yours, forging metal to withstand sword strikes, arrows, and even crushing blows from lances. Yet no instruction accompanies these creations for handling the desert's greatest threats: sand and sun. The wind carries fine grains like miniature knives, scratching at exposed skin, grinding against metal, and finding its way beneath the mail. Even the smallest crevice becomes a trap for particles, which abrade the metal and make every movement slightly more cumbersome. A shift of the shoulder brings the gnawing friction of sand caught in the underpadding. With each step, a faint grinding noise echoes from the joints of your armor, a subtle reminder that this environment was not anticipated by the smiths who made it. For centuries, knights have been trained to endure the weight of their armor under temperate skies. The standard campaigns in northern Europe, across wet fields or snowy plains, rewarded endurance in predictable climates. Water was scarce but not unknowable. Mud could be navigated with skill. The desert, by contrast, offers unpredictable windstorms, blinding flurries of fine sand, and temperatures that climb to oppressive heights before midday. Soldiers quickly learn that the simple act of walking becomes a laborious task, a test of stamina that wears both body and mind. Every step draws more sweat into the folds of padded undergarments, where the combination of moisture and sand begins to chafe. Metal, heated by the sun, radiates warmth directly against the skin. Leather straps stiffen and begin to cut. Helmets, which once felt like a protective dome, now trap heat and prevent ventilation. You begin to wonder whether the very tools meant to protect you have become instruments of suffering. The camels, strange beasts compared to European horses, carry their own burdens. Riders must adjust to the uneven gait of animals adapted to sand rather than stone or soil. Armor limits the agility required to mount, dismount, and react quickly if a camel balks at a dune's steep edge. The long, unshaded marches leave men exposed to sunburn and dehydration. You think about the officers back home who spoke of heroic charges and valorous jousts. None of them mentioned the crushing weight of molten sun on steel, nor the slow grinding of sand against every joint of your armor. For all their bluster about honor and protection, the instruments of knighthood reveal a fragility you had not anticipated. They protect against human weapons, yes, but the desert reminds you that nature can be just as lethal and far more persistent. Food and water, always logistical concerns, take on new importance. Leather water flasks warm quickly, making even the liquid inside tepid and unappealing. Bread dries and hardens in the sun within hours, forcing soldiers to eat small pieces at intervals. Salted meat sweats in the midday heat. Even the simple act of eating or drinking becomes a laborious process when you are clad in armor. You loosen straps just enough to sip water, Feel the sand biting against your fingers as you do so, then carefully reassemble the straps before moving again. Each action is slower, more deliberate. You find yourself reflecting on the delicate balance of survival. The armor that shields against swords, arrows, and spears now threatens heat exhaustion if not managed correctly. The wind, a constant companion, shifts suddenly and without warning. A sandstorm rises from the horizon like a wall, blotting out the sun and reducing visibility to a few paces ahead. The grains bite against exposed skin, entering eyes, nose, and mouth. You hunch forward instinctively, trying to shield yourself. The helmet offers partial protection, yet every gap between visor and gorget channels the sand inside. The once comfortable padding now scratches against your neck and shoulders as it shifts with your movements. Breathing becomes a conscious act, a slow attempt to avoid inhaling the storm's particulate. The army's march slows to a crawl. Orders are shouted and barely heard. Even the horses stumble in the unseen dips of sand, while camels hesitate and snort in alarm. You begin to understand, viscerally, the limits of armor designed for other climates. Despite the discomfort, there is an art to enduring the storm. Soldiers develop techniques, learned from trial and error, turning the back to the wind to reduce sand intrusion, keeping helmets slightly ajar to allow ventilation without exposing the eyes, brushing away layers of accumulated grit during brief pauses. Every adaptation is minor, but cumulatively they matter. The army survives because its members learn to respect the environment's peculiarities rather than rely solely on metal and muscle. In these moments, the knight's armor seems both magnificent and almost absurd, capable of withstanding the blows of men, yet impotent against the patient, grinding force of the desert itself. You catch glimpses of your companions as the storm passes. Faces are streaked with sweat and dust, armor dented and scratched, yet no one complains aloud. In silence, each man seems to acknowledge the strange, humbling lessons of the environment. The desert does not care about rank, lineage, or valor. It merely tests endurance and ingenuity. You reflect on the strange paradox. The very armor meant to protect you now amplifies discomfort, yet simultaneously offers the shield against sudden abrasions, thrown stones, and accidental collisions with other soldiers. Each man's survival depends not only on the steel and leather he wears, but also on his knowledge, adaptability, and quiet fortitude. By evening, when the sun dips low behind the dunes, you remove the armor piece by piece, knotting the grit embedded in seams, the fine scratches along metal, and the dark streaks of sweat and dust. Each component carries the evidence of survival. You clean and inspect the gear carefully. One missed abrasion could turn into rust overnight. One loose strap could make the next day's march unbearable. The quiet labor of maintenance feels as vital as any heroic charge, a mundane ritual that preserves life in a place that makes even small mistakes dangerous. As night falls, the desert cools and the wind shifts to a gentle sigh. You look back at the endless dunes and consider the coming days, longer marches, deeper storms, and harsher heat. Nights in history are remembered for victories and battles, yet here you begin to understand that survival itself is a battlefield. Steel can stop a sword, yes, but it cannot stop sun, sand, or exhaustion. You find yourself wondering, how did medieval armies accustomed to far cooler and wetter climates ever manage to traverse such deserts repeatedly? And if the armor that once defined their identity becomes a liability, what lessons from these trials were recorded, and which were simply forgotten in the chronicles of Europe? The night is silent but for distant camel calls and the subtle whisper of shifting sand. You lie under a coarse blanket, feeling the faint sting of sand left on your skin, pondering the limits of human ingenuity versus the relentlessness of nature. Perhaps the question is not whether armor works in the desert, but how men adapt when the tools of protection themselves challenge survival. The days following the first sandstorm follow a peculiar rhythm, one dictated less by orders from commanders and more by the desert itself. Dawn is a sudden, almost violent affair. The horizon glows pale, and the heat begins its slow climb almost immediately. Knights, squires, and common soldiers alike have learned the subtle art of packing themselves. It is no longer a matter of carrying a lance into a charge, but managing every ounce of energy to survive the march. You feel your body tense as leather straps tighten against warm metal. Every joint of your mail seems to groan in protest, and the sun presses down on the polished steel like a weight you cannot shrug off. The army has adapted its daily routine. Marches are broken into shorter segments, interspersed with frequent stops to drink tepid water and inspect armor for sand damage. Soldiers brush grit from chain links, wipe down straps, and apply oils to leather to prevent cracking. It is tedious work, repetitive and seemingly inconsequential, but it keeps the army mobile. Even the smallest neglect a bent rivet, a torn strap, or accumulated sand in a visor can turn into a dangerous liability under the unrelenting heat and shifting dunes. One of the most striking lessons of desert campaigns is the creativity that soldiers develop to mitigate discomfort. Mail coifs are often lined with additional cloth to trap air and reduce direct contact with heated metal. Helmets are padded with cloth soaked in water whenever possible, providing temporary relief, but requiring constant replenishment. Some soldiers improvise face coverings from scarves or linen wraps to protect eyes and noses from sand intrusion. Such adaptations are not recorded in grand chronicles, but appear repeatedly in personal letters and minor accounts from the campaigns in Acre, Harar, and other arid regions. These small innovations, mundane and almost invisible to history's grand narratives, are the difference between endurance and collapse. The logistical challenge of sustaining an armored force in desert conditions is staggering. Water is paramount. The army relies on camels, whose ability to carry both supplies and men is essential. Each camel requires careful handling. If the animal falters in heat or becomes spooked by a sudden sandstorm, the disruption can cascade, slowing the march and risking dehydration for both animal and rider. Food, too, is carefully rationed. Dried meat, hard bread, salted fish, and preserved legumes are staples, but the quality deteriorates rapidly in the sun. Officers develop intricate schedules to rotate rations, ensuring that no soldier goes without vital calories, though these measures can only go so far. Hunger is never fully banished, and fatigue gnaws at morale. Amid these challenges, human resilience emerges in unexpected ways. Soldiers form informal support networks, checking one another's armor, sharing water and shade, and offering small comforts like patched clothing or extra padding. A squire might remove a few links from a heavy chainmail shirt to reduce weight for a comrade struggling with heat exhaustion. Simple gestures, almost invisible, reinforce survival. Armies succeed less by grand strategy than by the cumulative effect of these countless minor acts of care, adaptations, and attentiveness. Combat, when it occurs, highlights the limitations of medieval armor in extreme conditions. Mounted charges across dunes are perilous. Horses and camels struggle with uneven footing, and knights often find themselves slower than infantry, whose lighter equipment allows more rapid movement. Arrows and spears are less effective than the environment itself. Sunstroke, dehydration, and abrasions from sand produce injuries that are slow to heal, reducing combat readiness as effectively as any enemy blade. Armor that once symbolized protection and prestige now serves as a constant reminder of human vulnerability in the face of natural forces. Surprisingly, the desert also offers tactical advantages. Sandstorms, while physically punishing, obscure vision and can be used to mask movement. Armies learn to anticipate wind directions, timing marches to take advantage of temporary cover or to hide encampments from hostile observers. Knights, who once relied solely on heavy armor and visible presence for intimidation, must rethink strategy. Subtlety and endurance become more valuable than flamboyant displays of strength. Here, the landscape itself dictates terms, and adaptation becomes a form of power as critical as any sword or lance. The monotony of daily survival has its own psychological weight. Soldiers begin to measure time not in hours but in small accomplishments. A successful day without heatstroke, a march completed without losing equipment, a night spent relatively free from sand intrusion. The human mind, you notice, becomes attuned to details previously considered irrelevant. Each scuff on armor, each scratch on leather, each shift in wind direction carries significance. You find yourself cataloging these minor details as though they are essential, because in this environment they truly are. Survival depends on noticing what might otherwise be ignored. The subtle shift of dunes, the way the sun glints off metal, the way sand settles in folds of clothing. Even social hierarchy adapts under these conditions. Commanders who cannot endure the heat lose authority. Their words carry less weight when they falter. A young soldier with practical knowledge of camel handling or sandstorm survival may become disproportionately influential, not because of rank, but because competence in extreme conditions commands respect. These small disruptions in traditional structures hint at a broader lesson. Medieval warfare, often romanticized as noble and orderly, is in fact deeply contingent on the ordinary capabilities of men and animals in inhospitable environments. Letters sent home from desert campaigns offer a rare glimpse into daily realities. Most recount minor discomforts, grumbles about spoiled rations, the slow work of cleaning armor, and small triumphs over fatigue or sand intrusion. These accounts, dull by design, provide historians with invaluable insight. They show that the heroism of knights often masks a far more prosaic struggle, the relentless negotiation between human ingenuity, equipment limitations, and environmental extremes. In these letters, you find a quiet heroism, the kind that does not end in a battlefield victory, but in simply surviving another day of grinding wind, heat, and sand. By mid-campaign, a soldier begins to internalize a rhythm. He learns to move in measured steps, to conserve energy in moments of stillness, to anticipate the abrasive intrusion of sand in armor joints, and to maintain hydration through careful rationing. The steel that once defined his identity now functions as both ally and obstacle, demanding respect and deliberate attention. Adaptation is continuous. A strap loosened, a helmet adjusted, a scarf tied differently. The desert teaches that survival is less about brute strength and more about the quiet, cumulative power of meticulous, mundane actions. As the army approaches its first major engagement, the question of armor's utility looms large. Will the steel that once promised invulnerability suffice against both enemy forces and the desert itself? Or will the harsh climate undermine the very purpose of these carefully forged protections? Knights, squires, and infantry alike must confront the possibility that their most trusted tools may also be their heaviest liabilities. In the coming days, these doubts will be tested not in grandiose battles alone, but in the persistent, inescapable trial imposed by sand, wind, and relentless sun. The sun dips low on the horizon again, and the desert begins to cool. Shadows lengthen across the dunes, and a strange calm falls over the army. You examine your armor one final time before night, noticing new scratches, grains of sand embedded in the chain links, and streaks of sweat on leather. Each mark tells a story of adaptation, endurance, and subtle triumphs. And yet, a lingering question remains. In the next storm, will these hard-won adjustments be enough, or will the desert reveal vulnerabilities yet unseen? The desert has a peculiar way of teaching lessons. By the time the army reaches its first significant engagement, months of marching, adaptation, and minor victories over wind and sand have left their mark. Armor, once pristine and symbolic, is now a patchwork of scratches, dents, and embedded grit. Chainmail rings have rubbed thin in some places. Leather straps are softened and stretched by heat and moisture. The men themselves are leaner, tanned, and wary, carrying fatigue in muscles and joints that were once untested by such relentless conditions. The battle is not as grandiose as songs would suggest. Dunes replace castles. Sand, the the battlefield's great equalizer. Enemy forces appear over a rise, cavalry moving with surprising agility despite heat, sand clinging to leather and metal in patterns similar to your own. The first clash is sudden, a flurry of spears and arrows, the desert swallowing sound and disorienting both sides. Knights discover immediately that agility has become a greater advantage than armor's sheer protection. Horses stumble, metal clinks heavily, and men become targets not merely of enemy weapons, but of exhaustion and the unforgiving terrain. Here the limitations of armor are stark. Steel, once thought invulnerable, now serves more as a symbol than a practical safeguard. Mail shirts, heavy and inflexible, slow movement across shifting sand. Helmets, though essential against sword strikes, trap heat and contribute to dehydration. You watch a comrade falter under his own equipment, his movement slowed, the visor of his helmet fogged with sweat and sand. In these moments, survival is measured not by heroism in combat but by practical adaptation. Lighter weapons, strategic movement, careful hydration, and an understanding of the environment. Yet armor is not without merit. Even battered and scratched, it still prevents fatal injuries. A lance strike glances off a well-maintained cuirass. A stray arrow thuds harmlessly into a reinforced pauldron. Soldiers realize that while metal cannot stop sunstroke or fatigue, it does buy crucial seconds, moments that allow them to retreat, reposition, or assist comrades. The dual nature of armor, both hindrance and protection, is revealed fully in this environment, forcing a delicate balance between survival and combat effectiveness. Battle, though chaotic, is a testament to human ingenuity. Knights who have learned to adjust their movement, lighten their load, and anticipate environmental hazards fare better than those who cling solely to traditional methods. Infantry, lighter and more flexible, exploit gaps in enemy formations created by the cumbersome knights. Commanders begin to recognize that rigid adherence to European tactics designed for temperate climates and firm ground fails when confronted with sand, sun, and wind. Adaptation, improvisation, and subtle adjustments outweigh raw strength or flashy maneuvers. After the engagement, the army assesses its losses, both visible and hidden. Some soldiers are injured, not by swords or arrows, but by heat stroke or sand abrasions. Armor is dented, bent, and coated in layers of sand. Many pieces require careful repair to remain functional. Yet despite these challenges, morale is not entirely broken. The men have survived both battle and environment, their endurance a quiet victory in itself. Letters sent home describe neither glory nor heroics, but the slow triumph of continued existence in a punishing landscape. In the days that follow, lessons are cemented. Armor maintenance becomes more rigorous. Chainmail is oiled and cleaned daily, leather conditioned to prevent cracking. Soldiers develop routines for hydration, movement, and sand mitigation. Minor innovations, such as cloth wraps for helmets, reinforced padding, or adjusted straps, become standardized across the company. Even in the absence of formal instruction, the army evolves organically, driven by necessity and experience rather than doctrine. Reflecting on these experiences, a broader truth emerges. Medieval armor, glorious and effective in European battlefields, was never designed for desert climates. Its utility in such conditions depends less on metallurgy or craftsmanship and more on human adaptability. Survival is a negotiation between tool and environment. Steel cannot conquer sun or sand, but ingenuity, endurance, and careful observation can. This is the quiet lesson often overlooked in chronicles of battles and sieges. The environment shapes human outcomes as much as strategy or courage. Ultimately, the desert campaigns reveal a subtle, overlooked aspect of medieval history. Armor is not merely a protective layer. It is a living system, requiring constant maintenance, observation, and adaptation to be effective. Knights and soldiers are simultaneously engineers, logisticians, and survivalists, navigating challenges that extend far beyond the battlefield. By the time the army reaches its final encampment, You understand that the narrative of heroism is incomplete without acknowledging the relentless, often mundane struggles that made survival possible. The question that remains, unspoken yet persistent, is this: how many victories in history were not just won by skill or strategy, but by the quiet, disciplined management of discomfort, fatigue, and environmental hazard? The steel of a knight's armor tells part of the story, but the men who wore it adapting, enduring, and surviving carry the rest. As night falls, and the dunes cool beneath a star-filled sky, you remove your armor once more. The scratches, dents, and embedded sand are a testament to struggle and endurance, an almost invisible record of human resilience. In these ordinary, painstaking details lies a profound truth. History is not only shaped by battles won or lost, but by the silent negotiation between human ingenuity and the relentless forces of the natural world. The armor has survived, the men have survived, but the desert remains undefeated, patient, persistent, and eternal. Story 2. Sand, Sweat, and Chainmail. Campaigns in the Middle East. The Middle Eastern deserts, vast and unforgiving, stretch far beyond what the European imagination can easily comprehend. Sand dunes ripple like golden waves, punctuated by jagged rock formations, dry riverbeds, and the occasional sparse oasis. For a medieval European knight or foot soldier, the terrain itself is a foreign adversary, shaping the journey more than enemy forces ever could. It is in this environment that you begin to understand the quiet demands of survival, how the simplest tasks, walking, drinking, sleeping, become tests of ingenuity and endurance. Campaigns in this region, particularly during the Crusades, introduced knights to heat, dust, and logistical challenges they had rarely encountered at home. The armies that arrived from Europe were clad in heavy armor, accustomed to temperate climates, rain-soaked roads, and snow-laden fields. Here, the same armor that once symbolized martial prowess becomes both a lifeline and a liability. Each suit of chainmail, helmet, cuirass, and greave serves to protect against combat, yet it also traps heat, holds moisture, and collects sand. Soldiers quickly learn that endurance, rather than boldness, is often the deciding factor in survival. The daily march is slow and deliberate. Sunlight strikes from high above, and the air shimmers with heat waves that distort vision. Dust clings to leather straps and metal links, entering every seam of armor. Soldiers develop a rhythm, moving a few dozen paces, pausing to remove accumulated sand, sipping from leather flasks of water, adjusting scarves or cloth wraps to shield faces and eyes. The weight of armor magnifies fatigue. Chainmail presses against shoulders and chest, a constant, invisible pressure that drains energy as surely as the sun drains moisture. Camels, more suited to this terrain than horses, become invaluable. Their gait is uneven, their reactions unpredictable, but they can carry heavy loads over vast distances without water for days. Knights and infantry alike learn to ride cautiously, balancing the need for speed against the risk of overturning their mounts or tipping into a hidden sand depression. Even minor miscalculations, misjudging a dune slope, losing footing, or allowing equipment to snag, can result in injury or exhaustion. Armies develop strategies not for bold maneuvers, but for careful negotiation with the environment itself. The soldiers' diet and hydration routines adapt accordingly. Bread hardens under the relentless sun, meat spoils rapidly, and water becomes a precious resource. Soldiers ration carefully, taking small sips at intervals rather than drinking large quantities at once. Salted food helps retain hydration, but the combination of salt, sun, and exertion ensures that thirst never disappears completely. Meals are eaten quickly, with hands dusted in sand, armor partially loosened to allow ventilation, and faces shaded with makeshift cloth wraps. The routine is mundane, repetitive, yet it is fundamental. Without these small adjustments, fatigue or heat stroke could decimate the army long before it meets any enemy force. Despite the challenges, soldiers begin to develop ingenious adaptations. Cloth padding is placed beneath metal to reduce heat transfer. Helmets are modified with makeshift ventilation or cloth coverings to prevent sand from entering the eyes and nose. Chainmail shirts are oiled or brushed regularly to prevent the accumulation of abrasive grit. Small innovations spread through the ranks quietly, often initiated by ordinary soldiers rather than officers, as necessity favors practicality over tradition. These adjustments are rarely recorded in official chronicles, yet they play a crucial role in survival. The interaction between armor, climate, and combat readiness becomes increasingly apparent. Knights discover that even minor sandstorms can render a suit of armor a burden. The clinking of chainmail, once reassuring, now amplifies exhaustion, and the accumulation of sand in joints reduces flexibility. Helmets trap heat and hinder breathing, while greaves press against fatigued legs, making even a short march a struggle. In contrast, lightly armored infantry, capable of adjusting layers of clothing and moving more freely, gain an unexpected advantage. Armies begin to reconsider the balance between protection and mobility, realizing that traditional European equipment is ill-suited to extreme desert conditions. Long-term campaigns reveal the subtler psychological effects of this environment. Monotony, heat, and dust erode morale. Soldiers measure days by the completion of minor tasks, maintaining armor, finding shade, rationing water, or navigating between dunes. Communication becomes limited by distance and dust-laden winds, with orders often delayed or misunderstood. Commanders, accustomed to immediate compliance, find themselves challenged by an environment that enforces a slower pace and demands patience. In these circumstances, leadership is measured less by battlefield acumen than by practical problem-solving, and the ability to manage fatigue, resources, and morale under relentless conditions. Campsites, when found, are carefully selected for shade, water availability, and defensibility. Soldiers spend hours removing sand from armor, inspecting chain links, repairing leather straps, and ensuring that flasks and supplies are organized. Even the smallest oversight, a dented cuirass, torn strap, or fouled water container, can compromise readiness for the next day. The repetitive, seemingly mundane labor of preparation is as critical as any sword or lance in determining who survives and who succumbs to the desert's relentless demands. As the first skirmishes with local forces occur, the practical limitations of European armor become starkly evident. Spear thrusts glance off chainmail, but heat and exhaustion make effective offensive action difficult. Helmets obscure vision when dust fills the air, and heavy armor slows reaction times on uneven sand. Soldiers realize that survival requires not only martial skill, but also a keen awareness of their environment, the ability to move efficiently, and a willingness to adapt strategies to local conditions. Victory is no longer simply a matter of strength or courage. It is a product of observation, adaptation, and endurance. Even in these trying circumstances, camaraderie emerges as a vital component of survival. Soldiers assist one another with adjusting armor, sharing water, or providing shade. Knowledge is passed quietly: which dunes hide softer sand, how to position a camel to avoid fatigue, how to clean chainmail quickly without damaging it. These small, almost invisible acts of cooperation become a cornerstone of the campaign. The success of the army is measured not just in battlefield victories, but in the quiet, cumulative effects of human ingenuity, discipline, and mutual support. By the end of the first weeks in the desert, the army has changed profoundly. Knights once accustomed to rigid routines and European climates now carry a wealth of practical knowledge: how to preserve energy, mitigate sand intrusion, and maintain armor under extreme conditions. Every dent in chainmail, scratch in a cuirass, and smudge on a helmet tells the story of adaptation. The soldiers have survived not because of heroic charges or grand strategies alone, but because they have learned to endure, to innovate, and to respect the desert as an ever-present, demanding opponent. As night falls over the dunes and a pale moon rises above the horizon, you pause to consider the journey ahead. The challenges of armor, sand, and heat are far from over. Battles await, each with its own unforeseen difficulties, and the desert continues its slow, patient testing of every man and piece of equipment. You realize that the most significant victories of this campaign may not be recorded in chronicles or celebrated in songs, but in the survival, adaptation, and quiet fortitude of soldiers learning to thrive where their armor alone cannot guarantee safety. The question that lingers in your mind as you remove dust-laden armor and sip tepid water is deceptively simple. How do men and machines endure in an environment that seems to test the limits of both at every step? And what lessons from these overlooked campaigns were carried back to Europe, if any at all? The desert does not forgive ignorance. After the first weeks of marching and skirmishes, soldiers have begun to internalize lessons learned through exhaustion, frustration, and occasional misfortune. You notice that minor details once irrelevant in the damp, temperate fields of Europe now determine survival. The way a camel is led, the angle of a shield against sun and wind, the positioning of a tent to trap what little shade is available, all these choices carry weight. Every decision feels amplified because the desert's environment magnifies consequences. A small mistake can lead to heat stroke, dehydration, or a compromised position in battle. Daily routines evolve into a system of meticulous preparation. Knights and infantry alike maintain armor with painstaking care. Chainmail is brushed to remove sand, leather straps treated to prevent cracking, and helmets lined with damp cloth for temporary cooling. Soldiers develop strategies to mitigate the sun's intensity, such as walking during cooler parts of the day and resting in shallow depressions to avoid wind. Even the way boots strike the sand is adjusted to minimize sinking and conserve energy. It is a study in micro-adaptation, where small adjustments cumulatively influence the ability to march, fight, and endure. Water, as ever, is the most precious commodity. Supply lines stretch across barren landscapes, relying heavily on camel caravans. Soldiers measure their consumption carefully, sipping at regular intervals rather than drinking freely. Commanders monitor usage meticulously, knowing that losing even a few camels or misjudging a ration could lead to disaster. Water scarcity also affects morale. Men are forced to drink warm, brackish water at times, and some endure dehydration symptoms in silence, hiding fatigue and headaches so as not to alarm their companions. These small acts of discipline, often unremarked upon in the annals of history, are critical to keeping an army moving through inhospitable terrain. The sand itself proves a formidable opponent. Fine grains infiltrate armor, clothing, and gear, causing abrasions, scratches, and persistent discomfort. Soldiers devise clever solutions. Leather flaps over gaps in armor, improvised goggles fashioned from cloth, and layered tunics beneath chainmail to absorb friction. Even the placement of pouches and weapons is reconsidered to prevent sand from clogging mechanisms or irritating skin. Over time, these adjustments become standardized through word of mouth and observation, forming an informal body of desert survival knowledge among troops. Physical fatigue combines with psychological strain. Endless monotony, relentless sun, and the constant awareness of potential injury or death weigh on soldiers. Letters from these campaigns often dwell not on battles but on the minutiae of survival. The daily march, cleaning armor, securing water, and coping with dust-filled winds. Soldiers speak of small triumphs with the same reverence European chronicles reserve for victories in combat. Enduring an entire day without succumbing to sunstroke, repairing damaged equipment before it becomes critical, or finding shade where none seemed possible. In these uncelebrated efforts, you begin to see the invisible backbone of historical campaigns. Combat is shaped by these adaptations. Traditional European formations are modified to suit the desert environment. Heavy cavalry, once the centerpiece of medieval armies, moves more cautiously, aware of the limitations imposed by heat and sand. Infantry adapts, exploiting mobility advantages and observing enemy positions through the haze of dust. Skirmishes reveal a delicate balance. Armor provides protection against direct strikes, but the burden it imposes on movement and endurance limits its effectiveness in sustained engagements. Leaders realize that survival depends as much on environmental awareness as tactical prowess. The role of armor continues to evolve. Some knights modify or remove certain elements to reduce heat burden and improve mobility, trading full protection for flexibility. Greaves are loosened, surcoats removed, and helmets adjusted to allow ventilation. The decision to adapt or remain fully armored becomes a constant negotiation. Safety versus endurance. Soldiers must weigh each choice against the combined threat of enemy forces and the environment itself. These choices, seemingly mundane, shape the outcome of campaigns in ways grand strategies alone cannot predict. Supply logistics remain a constant concern. Camels carry water, rations, and spare equipment, but the desert tests both animal and human limits. A single misjudged march can deplete water stores, strain the animals, and slow the entire army. Officers implement rotation schedules to reduce fatigue on both men and mounts, and small encampments are established at predictable intervals to allow for rest and maintenance. Even minor innovations, such as tying leather flaps to shield camels' eyes or improvising shade for water containers, have a disproportionate effect on efficiency and survival. Over time, an unspoken culture of observation and improvisation develops among soldiers. Experienced men teach newcomers how to anticipate wind shifts, recognize deceptive dunes, and identify terrain that offers both concealment and stability. Lessons are passed down quietly, often without formal orders, but they are essential for survival. Adaptation becomes second nature, and the cumulative effect of these small, practical strategies allows the army to function despite an environment designed to hinder every movement. Morale is reinforced by small acts of cooperation. Soldiers share water, assist one another with armor adjustments, and help repair damaged equipment. Camaraderie, forged in shared discomfort, becomes a crucial factor in endurance. The army learns that survival is not a solitary achievement but a collective effort. The success of the group depends on the attentiveness, ingenuity, and endurance of each member. In these quiet interactions lies the often overlooked human story of medieval campaigns. Ordinary men, performing mundane but essential tasks, shaping the course of history through diligence rather than spectacle. As the army prepares for a larger confrontation with local forces, you realize that environmental mastery is as critical as martial skill. Knights who have internalized desert survival principles, efficient movement, careful hydration, sand mitigation, and strategic adaptation of armor are more effective in combat than those relying solely on tradition or brute strength. The desert has forced a reevaluation of strategy, technique, and even equipment, revealing that victory is contingent not only on courage, but on the quiet accumulation of practical knowledge. The sun sets over the dunes, painting the landscape in deep oranges and golds. Shadows stretch long, and a faint wind stirs the sand. Soldiers remove their armor with habitual care, inspecting each link, strap, and buckle. The labor is mundane, repetitive, yet essential. A single oversight could compromise the following day's survival. The quiet diligence is both humbling and profound, a reminder that the true measure of a campaign is not always found in recorded victories, but in the persistence, adaptation, and endurance of those who lived it. A lingering question remains as the night falls. In an environment so hostile, where even steel becomes a burden, which adaptations would endure, and which would be forgotten in the chronicles of European history. The desert tests not only body and armor, but memory itself. What will history remember, and what will remain hidden in sand and sweat? By the time the army approaches its first major stronghold in the desert, months of marching, adaptation, and small triumphs over sun and sand have transformed the men. What began as a collection of European knights, squires, and infantry now resembles a community of desert veterans. Bodies tanned and lean, armor scratched and dulled, minds attuned to environmental subtleties invisible to those untested by relentless heat and wind. Every dent in mail, scratch in leather, or shift in helmet carries a story of endurance, improvisation, and quiet ingenuity. The engagement itself is neither grand nor cinematic. Unlike the pitched battles in northern Europe, the desert confrontation unfolds as a careful negotiation with the terrain. Dunes obscure movement, sandstorms reduce visibility, and heat slows reaction times. Cavalry charges are limited by footing, and infantry must contend with both enemy spears and the physical constraints imposed by armor. You realize quickly that armor's value is measured not only in its defensive capability, but in how well it allows men to survive both environment and combat. Steel that performed flawlessly on stone roads now exacts a toll: slowed movement, trapped heat, and cumulative fatigue. Yet despite its limitations, armor remains indispensable. A chainmail shirt deflects a javelin. A helmet prevents a glancing sword blow from breaking a skull. Each strike that armor absorbs is a small victory, often invisible in the larger narrative of battle but critical to survival. Soldiers who have adapted loosening greaves, lining helmets with cloth, carrying water efficiently fare better than those relying solely on traditional methods. The desert favors those who can balance protection with endurance, mobility with security, and tradition with innovation. The battle is grueling but brief. Units maneuver carefully, exploiting dunes for cover and using sandstorms as temporary shields. Soldiers rely on instincts honed over weeks: how to step to avoid deep sand, when to remove a gauntlet to brush off grit, and how to guide camels safely through unstable terrain. The confrontation demonstrates a subtle truth. Success depends less on sheer strength and more on cumulative small adaptations, practical knowledge, and quiet coordination. It is the often unrecorded actions maintaining gear, managing hydration, adjusting armor that determine who endures the day. After the engagement, the army assesses its condition. Injuries from combat are relatively minor compared to exhaustion, dehydration, and sand abrasions. Equipment is damaged, but careful maintenance ensures that it remains functional. Soldiers share water and tend to one another, reinforcing a sense of mutual reliance essential for continued survival. Even minor acts of care, tightening a strap, removing a stubborn grain of sand from a joint, offering shade, carry disproportionate importance. Here, the mundane labor of maintenance and observation is inseparable from the story of military success. Historical lessons begin to emerge. Armor, while symbolically central to knighthood, cannot fully protect against environmental extremes. Survival requires constant adaptation. Movement must be measured, hydration carefully managed, and protective gear continuously maintained. Small innovations, scarf coverings, improvised helmet ventilation, cloth padding under chainmail often determine the difference between life and incapacitation. These adjustments are rarely recorded in grand chronicles, yet they shape the outcomes of campaigns in profound ways. The desert also reshapes social dynamics. Commanders must recognize practical expertise over rank alone, relying on soldiers who understand environmental subtleties. Knowledge is decentralized. Guidance comes from experience, observation, and necessity rather than formal training. This subtle shift highlights a larger truth. Medieval armies, often depicted as hierarchical and rigid, relied heavily on ordinary soldiers' ingenuity when confronted with unfamiliar and extreme conditions. As the army moves toward its next objective, you reflect on the broader implications of the campaign. Soldiers have survived not through heroics alone, but through endurance, careful observation, and adaptation. They have learned that the most significant victories are often invisible, the completion of a march without casualties from heat, the preservation of equipment under punishing conditions, the quiet acts of cooperation that allow an army to function. The desert, in its relentless impartiality, has revealed the limits of armor, the necessity of human ingenuity, and the subtle ways survival shapes historical outcomes. At night, under a canopy of stars, you remove your armor and inspect it by lantern light. Every dent, scratch, and grain of embedded sand tells a story of adaptation and endurance. The equipment that once defined identity now serves as a record of resilience and learning. The army has survived the desert, but the desert remains undefeated, patient, persistent, and impartial. A final reflection lingers. History often celebrates grand battles, heroic knights, and spectacular victories. Yet the quieter, often overlooked struggles, adaptation to extreme environments, meticulous maintenance of armor, the disciplined management of fatigue and resources may be equally decisive. The men who endured the desert did so not with glory, but with endurance, ingenuity, and patience. In these mundane, painstaking efforts lies a profound lesson. Survival, rather than spectacle, often dictates the course of history. And so, as the camp settles under the night sky, you realize that the question remains open. How many campaigns succeeded because of strategic brilliance, and how many succeeded because soldiers mastered the slow, invisible art of enduring the environment itself? Story 3: The Forgotten Siege, Castles and Sandstorms. Castles, long symbols of European military strength, were rarely built to withstand the relentless forces of desert wind and sand. When a European army attempted to besiege a fortress in the Middle East, the scene was far removed from the familiar damp stone and muddy moats of home. Here, the desert dictated the terms, shaping every element of siege warfare, from logistics to armor maintenance, from troop morale to the pace of construction. Survival and success were determined as much by adaptation to climate as by the strength of walls or the skill of engineers. The first challenge was the journey to the fortress itself. Marching in formation across dunes required constant vigilance. The sun rose quickly, and the heat climbed relentlessly. Soldiers adjusted armor to balance protection with mobility. Heavy plate or chainmail, effective in European sieges, pressed uncomfortably against sun-warmed skin. Helmets trapped heat, and gauntlets made even simple tasks carrying supplies, handling tools more difficult. Soldiers developed strategies, padding under mail shirts to prevent chafing, lining helmets with damp cloth to reduce heat, and timing movements to minimize exertion during peak sunlight. Every small adjustment mattered. One miscalculation could leave a man incapacitated before the siege even began. The desert sand compounded the difficulties. Wind-blown grains infiltrated armor joints, filled tents, and eroded wooden siege equipment. Engineers discovered that ropes, pulleys, and wooden frames required constant attention. Sand reduced friction in some areas while wearing down contact points in others. The men assigned to these tasks labored for hours in dust-choked air, cleaning, oiling, and adjusting materials. Armor, too, required daily maintenance. Chainmail links were brushed, leather straps conditioned, and helmets wiped clean of abrasive sand. The mundane work of upkeep became central to survival, illustrating a lesson often overlooked in chronicles of sieges. Victory depended as much on preparation and maintenance as on direct assault. Food and water logistics were critical. European armies were accustomed to rivers, wells, and temperate supply lines. In the desert, water became a strategic asset, carried carefully on camels, rationed meticulously, and shared sparingly among men and animals alike. Meals were limited and repetitive. Hard bread, salted meat, and preserved legumes, eaten quickly to conserve energy and avoid the constant intrusion of sand. Soldiers learned to measure effort against hydration, walking slowly across dunes rather than forcing rapid movement. Every sip, every morsel, was calculated against the relentless environmental demands. The psychological strain of the siege was equally significant. Dust storms could obscure visibility for hours, forcing soldiers to halt work or defend positions blindly. Even routine tasks digging trenches, erecting scaffolding, or moving siege engines required careful attention to avoid injury. The monotony of repetitive labor, combined with the harsh environment, tested morale. Soldiers developed informal routines to maintain focus, inspecting armor meticulously, adjusting gear, and helping comrades manage fatigue. In these quiet, repetitive tasks, the foundations of endurance were laid, often with little recognition beyond the men themselves. Armor proved both indispensable and burdensome. While it offered protection against arrows, stones, and occasional enemy sorties, it also trapped heat, restricted movement, and increased fatigue during labor-intensive siege work. Helmets fogged with sweat and sand, chainmail rubbed skin raw, and heavy greaves impeded climbing ladders or traversing uneven ground. Soldiers learned to loosen straps during labor and tighten them when danger approached, balancing protection against practicality. Each adaptation was small but cumulatively vital. Without such careful adjustments, men would be incapacitated before ever reaching the walls of the fortress. The fortress itself presented unique challenges. Desert castles were often constructed with stone designed to resist heat rather than impact. Walls absorbed and radiated heat, making prolonged exposure exhausting. Sandstorms reduced visibility and impeded artillery placement. Engineers had to modify traditional European siege techniques, relying on subtle, often tedious adjustments to ropes, levers, and pulleys. Every measurement, every placement of siege equipment required patience and attention to detail. The grand image of heroic assaults is belied by the reality of repetitive, laborious adjustments that ensured progress while minimizing casualties and equipment failure. Even at night, work did not cease entirely. Soldiers inspected armor for damage caused by sand abrasion, repaired leather straps, and ensured weapons remained functional. Camels were tended with care, fed and watered under minimal light to conserve energy. Small fires were avoided during particularly windy nights to reduce dust disruption. In these hours, the mundane routines of maintenance and vigilance continued silently, often more important than any combat strategy in determining the siege's outcome. Throughout the campaign, small acts of cooperation were critical. Soldiers helped one another remove sand, repair damaged armor, or adjust gear to maintain mobility. Engineers shared insights about environmental effects on siege equipment. Even minor tips: how to line a helmet with cloth to prevent heat, how to secure a rope in shifting sand, circulated informally, passing from experienced soldiers to newcomers. These quiet exchanges of knowledge often had a greater effect on operational success than formal orders from commanders. As the first significant skirmishes near the fortress occur, the limitations and adaptations of armor become starkly visible. Chainmail absorbs blows from arrows and stones, but men tire quickly under heat and weight. Helmets shield heads but trap heat and reduce awareness. Every strike, every exertion is compounded by the environment. Soldiers who have adapted through ventilation, padding, hydration, and movement adjustments perform better than those relying solely on traditional methods. Survival is measured in incremental gains. A repaired strap, a cleared visor, a camel safely led across shifting sand. By the end of the first week, the siege begins to reveal its quiet paradox. The fortress, designed for defense, is both an obstacle and a teacher. Soldiers gain practical knowledge about endurance, logistics, and the interaction between armor and environment. Success is incremental, composed of countless minor victories over fatigue, sand, and heat, rather than dramatic feats of strength or heroism. As night falls and the desert cools slightly, you remove armor and inspect each piece, noting scratches, sand intrusion, and wear. The labor is repetitive, mundane, but essential. Each dent and mark tells a story of adaptation, resilience, and survival. The siege has begun, but the larger question remains. How will human ingenuity, discipline, and endurance measure against the relentless, patient forces of desert wind and sand? The second week of the siege brings a rhythm that is part labor, part endurance test, and part quiet negotiation with the desert itself. The army has established encampments at intervals from the fortress, each chosen with care to maximize shade, access to water, and relative protection from wind. Soldiers awaken before dawn, performing the same meticulous routine, inspecting armor, checking equipment, distributing water, and readying camels for transport. Each small action is amplified in significance. Even a minor oversight could compromise the day's progress or endanger a life. Sandstorms, frequent and unpredictable, are the most persistent challenge. When the wind picks up, visibility drops to a few meters. Dust infiltrates chainmail, scratches exposed skin, and burrows into leather straps. Helmets offer partial protection, but sand enters through gaps, fouling vision and breathing. Soldiers learn to hunch forward, covering faces with scarves or tunics, pressing gauntlets against eyes, and moving cautiously to avoid missteps. Combat readiness is affected even when no enemy is present. The environment itself becomes an adversary, eroding endurance, morale, and precision. Maintenance of armor and equipment becomes a near-constant task. Chainmail is brushed to remove fine grit that threatens to wear away links. Leather straps are treated with oils or softened with water to prevent cracking. Helmets and greaves are inspected for dents, cracks, or loose rivets. Even the simplest act, tightening a strap or repositioning padding, can prevent injuries caused by the abrasive sand or prolonged exertion. The army quickly learns that survival depends less on the inherent strength of armor and more on the vigilance of those who wear and maintain it. Logistics dominate the planning of every movement. Water is rationed carefully, with precise allocation for soldiers, camels, and other animals. Food is simple but functional: hard bread, dried legumes, salted meat. Rations are calculated to sustain energy without waste. Camels are loaded to balance supplies evenly, ensuring animals are not overburdened in the sand. Routes between encampments are chosen for the firmness of the sand, presence of shade, and relative protection from wind. Every mile marched is an exercise in coordination, endurance, and attention to minor variables that could have life-or-death consequences. Daily labor includes moving siege equipment, digging trenches, and erecting scaffolds to approach the fortress walls. These tasks are made more difficult by the desert conditions. Sand shifts beneath tools, pulleys clog with grit, ropes fray more quickly, and wooden beams heat under the sun, making handling hazardous. Soldiers rotate responsibilities carefully, ensuring that fatigue does not accumulate dangerously. Armor adds both protection and burden. Chainmail shields against projectiles, but its weight slows movement during physically demanding tasks. Helmets prevent injury from falling debris yet trap heat and limit ventilation. Soldiers constantly negotiate between safety, efficiency, and the environment's constraints. Psychological endurance becomes as crucial as physical stamina. Endless labor, heat, and dust weigh on morale. Soldiers cope by creating small routines and systems, inspecting armor at the same time each day, maintaining a personal workspace free of excess sand, or offering quiet assistance to comrades struggling with fatigue. Even minor acts of care, sharing water, helping a fellow soldier repair a strap, offering a brief shadowed resting spot, become critical to collective endurance. Over time, these routines create a quiet culture of adaptation, resilience, and subtle cooperation that allows the army to function effectively despite extreme conditions. The fortress itself continues to test the army. Its walls are heat-soaked, radiating warmth that intensifies fatigue for anyone attempting to scale them. Defenders exploit environmental advantages, throwing sand and stones, using hidden firing points, and taking advantage of wind patterns to obscure visibility. Siege engines, carefully positioned, are continually threatened by shifting dunes, requiring constant adjustments. Even minor miscalculations in placement or timing can jeopardize the equipment or injure soldiers. Survival and progress rely on slow, deliberate, repetitive labor, often more than on daring assaults. The interaction between armor and environment becomes increasingly apparent. Chainmail provides protection from debris and enemy attacks, but its weight accelerates fatigue during repeated climbing or lifting tasks. Helmets shield against stones but increase heat stress. Soldiers adjust by loosening greaves, removing surcoats, or padding helmets for ventilation. These subtle adaptations are shared informally among troops and quickly spread, demonstrating that survival depends less on doctrine and more on practical ingenuity. As the siege continues, the cumulative effect of these small measures becomes clear. Soldiers endure longer marches, complete more labor-intensive tasks, and maintain combat readiness despite the desert's relentless pressures. Yet even with these adaptations, the desert's dominance is undeniable. Sandstorms, blistering sun, and shifting dunes continue to challenge every aspect of the campaign. Victory depends not on a single heroic charge, but on the quiet, consistent application of knowledge, care, and discipline. By the second week's end, a subtle tension arises. Soldiers and commanders alike recognize that while minor adaptations have allowed survival so far, the siege's success is not guaranteed. Environmental hazards are constant, enemy resistance remains formidable, and armor, though protective, continues to exact a toll in energy and mobility. The men face a persistent, unspoken question. Will the combination of endurance, ingenuity, and careful labor be enough to overcome both fortress and desert? Or will exhaustion and environmental forces undermine the army before triumph can be achieved? As night falls, the desert cools slightly, and the camp settles into quiet vigilance. Soldiers remove armor for inspection, tend to camels, and prepare for the next day. Each dent, scratch, and grain of sand in armor tells a story of adaptation and survival. Yet the larger question remains unresolved. Even with ingenuity and discipline, can human effort overcome an environment designed to test endurance at every step? By the third week of the siege, the desert has transformed the army in subtle but profound ways. What began as a collection of knights and infantry, accustomed to temperate European climates, now functions as a cohesive unit of desert-hardened soldiers. Bodies are lean and tanned, muscles conditioned to constant exertion, and minds attuned to subtle environmental cues: the shift of a dune, the direction of wind, or the telltale signs of an approaching sandstorm. Every dent in armor, scratch in leather, and smudge on a helmet tells a story of survival, adaptation, and careful observation. The assault on the fortress, when it finally begins, is a slow, deliberate affair. Traditional European strategies, charges, ladders, and battering rams must be modified to account for the sand, heat, and wind. Heavy cavalry moves cautiously, aware of unstable footing, while infantry coordinates laboriously to move siege engines and scaffolds across dunes. Soldiers rely heavily on adaptations developed over weeks: helmets ventilated with cloth padding, chainmail adjusted for comfort, and movement carefully timed to conserve energy. In many ways, the battle is as much a contest of endurance and adaptation as it is of arms. Armor, which once symbolized protection and prestige, continues to play a dual role. Chainmail deflects arrows and stones, while helmets prevent injuries from falling debris. Yet the weight and rigidity of armor also slow movement and accelerate fatigue. Soldiers must constantly negotiate between protection and practicality, loosening straps during labor, tightening them for potential enemy strikes, and adjusting padding to prevent chafing. Survival is measured not just in avoiding injury, but in maintaining the capacity to continue working and fighting under harsh conditions. The siege tests ingenuity as much as courage. Engineers adapt traditional equipment for shifting sand. Ropes are secured differently, pulleys lubricated against grit, and siege towers carefully repositioned to maintain balance. Camels carry supplies strategically, while soldiers rotate duties to prevent exhaustion. Minor innovations: improvised face coverings, small water ration adjustments, or temporary repairs to armor have disproportionate effects on operational efficiency. The siege demonstrates that victory in this environment is less about heroics and more about meticulous preparation, observation, and incremental adaptation. Psychological resilience is equally critical. The monotony of labor, the harsh climate, and constant dust exposure weigh heavily on morale. Soldiers develop small routines to maintain focus, inspecting armor systematically, sharing water judiciously, and helping comrades with minor repairs. These quiet acts of cooperation and discipline create a culture of endurance that allows the Army to continue functioning effectively despite extreme adversity. The cumulative impact of these mundane but essential tasks is immense, highlighting the often overlooked human factors in historical campaigns. By the final days of the siege, it becomes clear that the environment has shaped outcomes as much as combat itself. Soldiers who have mastered the rhythm of desert life, balancing exertion, hydration, armor maintenance, and environmental awareness, perform far better than those who cling to traditional methods. Even minor oversights, such as failing to clean sand from mail or misjudging sun exposure, result in injury or diminished effectiveness. Victory is as much a product of adaptation as of strategy, a lesson often hidden in the grand narratives of history. When the fortress finally surrenders, it is not solely the result of force but of endurance, patience, and quiet ingenuity. The walls were formidable and the defenders skilled, but the Army's ability to survive, adapt, and maintain operational effectiveness over weeks of harsh conditions proved decisive. Soldiers removed their armor at dusk, inspecting it for scratches, dents, and embedded sand. Each piece serves as a record of trial and perseverance, evidence that human ingenuity and endurance can overcome the most relentless of environments, even when the tools themselves complicate survival. The broader lesson is clear. Medieval campaigns were rarely won solely through bravery or skill in battle. Environmental mastery, practical adaptation, and diligent maintenance of both men and equipment were often decisive. Armor, once considered a symbol of power and protection, is revealed as part of a system that requires constant attention, adjustment, and care. Survival in extreme conditions depends on countless small actions: adjusting straps, brushing sand from chainmail, rationing water, and packing movement to conserve energy. These ordinary acts, largely invisible in formal chronicles, often determined historical outcomes. As the Army camps under the cooling desert night, the stars reflecting off the dunes, one reflection remains. History remembers victories, not the painstaking labor, ingenuity, and endurance that made them possible. Armor and weapons are celebrated, but survival, the quiet mastery of environment, routine, and adaptation, remains largely invisible. The desert, patient and impartial, has tested the Army at every step, revealing the delicate balance between human capability and environmental forces. And so, the final thought lingers. Even the mightiest fortress, the most carefully forged armor, and the most disciplined soldiers cannot succeed without subtle, ongoing attention to the mundane realities of survival. What stories of endurance, adaptation, and quiet ingenuity have been lost to history, unrecorded, even as the grand narrative of conquest survives? Story 4: Camels and Crusaders, Logistics in the Sands. If the desert teaches a single lesson, it is that survival depends on preparation and persistence, not just valor or skill. For medieval armies campaigning in the Middle East, logistics were a constant, invisible battle. Soldiers could charge valiantly, castles could fall, and battles could be won or lost, but without water, food, and transport, none of it would matter. In the endless dunes, where heat radiates from sand and rocks, the quiet, repetitive work of supplying an army was as crucial as any combat maneuver. Camels were the unsung heroes of these campaigns. Unlike horses, camels are adapted to arid environments, capable of traveling long distances without water, carrying heavy loads, and surviving temperatures that would incapacitate most European mounts. Each camel, however, required careful management. Soldiers had to balance loads precisely. A misbalanced pack could cause the animal to stumble, injure itself, or collapse under strain. Armor and weapons were often loaded onto camels, sometimes alongside tents, water skins, and food. A single misstep could create a domino effect, disrupting the supply line and threatening the health of both animals and men. Water, the most precious resource in the desert, dictated the pace and planning of every march. Soldiers carried leather flasks, sometimes filled days in advance, rationing their contents carefully. Camels carried additional water, but the supply was finite, and every sip had to be calculated. Commanders mapped routes meticulously, relying on knowledge of oases, wells, and seasonal riverbeds. Even minor miscalculations, overestimating an oasis's yield, underestimating heat loss, or delaying rationing could result in dehydration, exhaustion, or worse. Survival, you realize, is as much arithmetic as courage. Liters of water per soldier, per camel, per day, balanced against distance and temperature. Food logistics were similarly meticulous. European soldiers, accustomed to temperate climates, were limited to what could endure the desert sun: hard bread, dried legumes, salted or smoked meat, and occasionally preserved dairy. Meals were rationed, often eaten quickly during brief pauses in marching. Soldiers learned to balance caloric intake with the energy expended in armor, while also considering water consumption. Overeating could hasten thirst, undereating reduced stamina. The combination of heat, exertion, and limited diet required constant vigilance. Even a seemingly minor lapse in ration management could render a soldier ineffective in hours. Armor, once considered a knight's main advantage, posed an additional logistical challenge. Chainmail and plate must be cleaned and maintained despite sand, sweat, and heat. Mail rings are brushed, leather straps oiled, and helmets padded or ventilated. Armor increases energy expenditure. Each pound slows movement, increases heat stress, and demands more water and food. Soldiers learn to pace themselves carefully, removing or loosening certain elements during long marches, then readjusting for combat readiness. Every adjustment is small, repetitive, and meticulous, yet it can determine whether a man arrives at the battlefield fit to fight or collapsed by the side of the dunes. Camels, soldiers, and supplies moved together as a delicate system. Routes were selected not only for distance but for terrain, shade, and wind patterns. Marching in formation was often impossible. Dunes shifted, and sandstorms could reduce visibility to a few meters. Officers relied heavily on experienced soldiers who knew how to guide animals over treacherous ground, how to distribute loads, and how to maintain morale in oppressive heat. Even minor errors, stepping into soft sand, overloading a camel, or miscalculating water needs could cascade into serious logistical failures. Sandstorms introduced additional complexity. Dust infiltrated water containers, eroded leather, scratched chainmail, and buried tools and supplies. Soldiers learned to secure their packs carefully, cover flasks and food, and protect sensitive equipment. During particularly severe storms, marches had to halt, and men spent hours clearing sand from armor, tents, and provisions. The labor was monotonous, time-consuming, and exhausting, yet absolutely essential to prevent long-term attrition in the army. The psychological strain of logistics is easy to underestimate. Soldiers endured monotony, heat, and constant vigilance, all while performing repetitive, physically demanding tasks. Camels had to be fed and checked for injuries, armor had to be maintained, and water rationed with mathematical precision. Morale depended as much on these mundane successes as on victories in battle. A ration correctly measured, a camel successfully led across a difficult dune, a chainmail repaired without damage, all were small victories that cumulatively ensured survival. Even the smallest innovations could make a significant difference. Soldiers learned to fashion cloth covers to reduce sun exposure on camels, to line helmets for ventilation, to pad straps to prevent chafing, and to arrange packs for balance and accessibility. Knowledge spread informally. Experienced men taught newcomers, and these small, practical adaptations allowed the army to function efficiently under extreme conditions. In these unrecorded details lies the backbone of successful desert campaigns: preparation, diligence, and adaptation. As the army nears the first fortified positions, the importance of logistics becomes undeniable. Soldiers are tired, armor is dusty and heavy, and water and food are carefully conserved for the coming challenge. Yet despite fatigue, the meticulous management of supplies, animals, and personal equipment ensures that men arrive capable of performing their duties. Victory, as it has often been in history, is as dependent on preparation, endurance, and the quiet labor of logistics as it is on skill or bravery in combat. Night brings little relief. Soldiers inspect armor, tend camels, and prepare for the next day's march. Water is measured, flasks refilled, and sand cleared from chainmail links. Even in darkness, attention to detail is paramount. One overlooked strap, one contaminated flask, or one improperly loaded camel could compromise the day's efforts. These mundane tasks, repeated over and over, are essential, forming the invisible foundation of the campaign's survival and success. By the end of the first section, a critical question emerges. How do armies balance the weight of armor, the demands of survival, and the necessities of supply under relentless desert conditions? The answer, you realize, will shape not only this campaign but the very way medieval soldiers understood endurance, adaptation, and the limits of human effort in extreme environments. By the second week of marching across the desert, the army has developed a fragile but effective rhythm, balancing the demands of human endurance, camel stamina, and the limitations imposed by armor. Every decision, from the timing of breaks to the placement of supplies, has immediate consequences. Soldiers have learned to move deliberately, conserving energy while maintaining progress toward strategic objectives. A misjudged step in soft sand, an overfilled water flask, or a misaligned load on a camel could set off a chain reaction, forcing hours of correction or leaving men physically compromised before they reach the next oasis. Water continues to dominate every planning decision. Officers measure the exact quantity each soldier receives, adjusting for exertion, armor weight, and ambient temperature. Camels, the central logistical backbone, carry extra reserves, but even these animals are vulnerable to heat stress, exhaustion, and dehydration. Soldiers develop techniques for both rationing and monitoring water, noticing subtle changes in urine color, observing camel behavior for signs of fatigue, and packing their own exertion to match available hydration. Every action, seemingly mundane, contributes directly to the survival of the group. Armor maintenance has become a near-constant occupation. Chainmail links accumulate sand that, left unchecked, can wear through steel and chafe skin. Helmets trap heat, necessitating ventilation adaptations such as cloth linings or removable visors. Leather straps, hardened by sun and sweat, are conditioned with oil to prevent cracking. Soldiers rotate responsibilities, ensuring that all equipment is inspected, repaired, and adjusted daily. These repetitive tasks are not dramatic, yet they are crucial. A single overlooked buckle or rusted link could leave a soldier vulnerable in an unforeseen skirmish or collapse from fatigue during the march. The desert itself is a persistent adversary. Sandstorms strike without warning, reducing visibility, disrupting movement, and infiltrating every crevice of armor and equipment. Soldiers brace themselves, using scarves and tunics to protect eyes and mouths, while adjusting helmet padding to limit abrasion. Camels are halted or guided carefully to avoid missteps in shifting dunes. Even small gusts of wind require constant vigilance. A misaligned pack can topple a camel, sending supplies scattering across a landscape where recovery is arduous and time-consuming. These environmental challenges shape every movement and decision, illustrating how armies in the desert are perpetually negotiating with nature as much as with any enemy force. The psychological demands of logistics are equally severe. Monotony, dust, and heat sap morale. Soldiers maintain focus through repetitive routines, taking comfort in minor victories. A pack successfully balanced, water rationed accurately, or armor repaired efficiently. Camaraderie plays a subtle but critical role. Experienced soldiers quietly instruct newcomers on techniques for protecting armor, balancing loads, or managing hydration. These small, informal exchanges of knowledge sustain operational capacity, allowing the army to function despite oppressive conditions. Food, while simple, is carefully rationed and distributed. Hard bread, dried legumes, and salted meat sustain energy, but do little to relieve the monotony of long marches. Soldiers learn to balance consumption with water availability and physical exertion, ensuring that energy is sustained without accelerating dehydration. Meals are often eaten quickly, hands covered in sand, armor partially loosened, and faces shaded. Each day's survival depends on these careful calculations, repeated with precision over weeks of movement across a featureless landscape. Camels themselves require meticulous attention. Each animal's health, load distribution, and behavior are monitored constantly. A camel that falters can disrupt an entire supply chain, forcing adjustments in march schedules and labor allocation. Soldiers learn to anticipate fatigue in animals as acutely as they monitor their own physical limits. Even seemingly minor interventions, adjusting a saddle, distributing weight differently, or encouraging an animal with careful guidance, have disproportionate effects on operational efficiency and safety. As the army nears strategic objectives, minor adjustments accumulate into significant advantages. Soldiers who pace themselves, maintain their armor, and monitor hydration outperform those who rely solely on strength or tradition. Camels deliver supplies intact, and logistical routines allow the army to reach key locations ready to fight. Environmental mastery, rather than brute force, becomes the decisive factor. Success in the desert is less a product of tactics and more a reflection of careful planning, observation, and disciplined execution of repetitive, mundane tasks. Even as night falls, the army's vigilance does not wane. Soldiers inspect armor, adjust straps, clean sand from chainmail, and ensure flasks and rations are properly organized. Camels are checked and fed, tents secured against wind, and equipment repaired for the next day's march. These repetitive, low-profile tasks, largely invisible in historical chronicles, form the foundation of survival. The desert tests endurance and discipline more than valor, demonstrating that even the finest armor and the most disciplined troops can falter without careful attention to logistics and preparation. By the second week's end, a lingering question emerges. How much of the army's success is due to skill in combat, and how much is owed to the quiet, meticulous management of supplies, equipment, and environmental adaptation? The desert has made one fact painfully clear. Victory is often determined not in heroic charges, but in the patient, disciplined performance of mundane tasks repeated day after day. By the third week of the desert march, the army has been reshaped quietly but profoundly. Men who began the campaign with little understanding of the desert now move with careful deliberation. Each step, each adjustment of armor, each rationed sip of water has been internalized as a matter of routine. Camels, once awkward companions unfamiliar to European soldiers, now follow commands with minimal oversight, carrying crucial supplies while their handlers monitor every breath, step, and sign of fatigue. Survival has become a skill in itself, honed through repetition, observation, and patience. The army approaches its first contested objective, a fortified outpost that commands a critical trade route. Traditional European tactics, heavy cavalry charges, massed infantry formations, and frontal assaults must be adapted to the desert environment. Dunes obscure movement, sandstorms reduce visibility, and heat saps energy. Soldiers who understand the environment, manage hydration, and adjust their armor effectively have a tangible advantage over those who cling to old methods. Their endurance, rather than sheer strength, determines readiness for engagement. Armor remains a double-edged tool. Chainmail deflects arrows and protects from accidental abrasions, yet its weight accelerates fatigue and traps heat. Helmets shield against debris, but also hinder ventilation and increase exhaustion. Soldiers have learned to strike a delicate balance, loosening greaves during long marches, adjusting padding in helmets, and removing surcoats during labor-intensive periods. Each decision, repeated hundreds of times over the march, ensures that men remain functional when combat arrives. Even minor miscalculations, forgotten straps, overlooked sand, or misbalanced packs could result in incapacitation or injury. Logistics, more than heroics, dictate the unfolding of the siege. Camels deliver water and rations precisely where needed, equipment arrives intact, and soldiers maintain readiness for labor or combat. The careful execution of routine, mundane tasks, adjusting armor, cleaning chainmail, rationing water, repairing packs, is what ultimately sustains the army. In this environment, even the smallest acts of foresight and diligence carry disproportionate weight. When skirmishes finally occur near the outpost, the advantages of preparation are clear. Soldiers who have adapted to the desert move efficiently, respond quickly to sudden threats, and conserve energy for critical moments. Armor protects them without unduly slowing their movements. Camels facilitate rapid resupply, allowing men to remain hydrated and fed while maintaining mobility. In contrast, troops who neglected adaptations falter quickly, revealing the vital importance of environmental mastery alongside combat skill. The campaign demonstrates an often overlooked truth of medieval warfare. Logistical and environmental mastery often outweighs valor or tactical brilliance. European armies, famed for their armored knights and disciplined infantry, might have dominated in temperate climates, but in the desert, success required careful planning, meticulous maintenance of equipment, and attentive management of men and animals. Every detail, from the angle of a saddle to the timing of a water break, had direct consequences on operational capacity. Psychological resilience plays a crucial role. Soldiers learn to endure monotony, manage discomfort, and persist under oppressive heat. Camaraderie and cooperation, helping comrades adjust armor, sharing water, repairing packs, become essential for collective survival. Success emerges not from grand gestures, but from countless small, deliberate acts repeated consistently. In this sense, the desert acts as a crucible, separating those who understand adaptation from those who rely solely on strength or tradition. By the campaign's end, the fortified outpost falls not through overwhelming force, but through the patient, consistent application of logistical knowledge, environmental awareness, and disciplined endurance. Soldiers remove armor at dusk, inspecting every link, strap, and buckle. Camels are tended, rations measured for the next march, and flasks refilled. The triumph is quiet but profound. Men and animals alike have survived, adapted, and overcome an environment that initially seemed insurmountable. The broader lesson is clear. Medieval success in harsh climates depended less on heroics and more on preparation, adaptation, and endurance. Armor and weapons provided protection, but survival required vigilance, ingenuity, and a willingness to adjust traditional practices. Everyday acts, maintaining gear, rationing water, guiding camels, enduring heat and dust, shaped outcomes as much as battles themselves. These unseen efforts, largely absent from celebrated chronicles, reveal the true backbone of historical campaigns. As night settles over the desert and stars glitter above the dunes, you are left with a final reflection. History often remembers victories, conquests, and heroic deeds, but the quiet, repetitive labor, the careful management of men, animals, and supplies, and the unrecorded ingenuity that made survival possible are equally decisive. Without these small, persistent efforts, the mightiest army and the finest armor could falter. The desert teaches that endurance, adaptation, and preparation are the silent arbiters of success, lessons that resonate far beyond the sands and centuries of medieval campaigns. And so, a lingering question remains. In the chronicles of history, how many victories credited to bold strategy or valor were, in fact, secured by the quiet, persistent mastery of environment and logistics that few ever recorded or celebrated? Story 5. Crossbows and Sand, the Limits of Medieval Weaponry. When European armies marched into the deserts of the Middle East, they brought with them weapons perfected for European climates. Crossbows with carefully tuned strings, swords forged for temperate battlefields, and maces designed to puncture armor without consideration for heat, sand, or shifting dunes. In practice, these weapons often struggled in ways chroniclers seldom noted, revealing the quiet limitations imposed by extreme environments and the ingenuity required to overcome them. Crossbows, for example, were highly effective in European sieges and open-field combat, where moisture, temperature, and terrain were predictable. In desert conditions, however, strings stretched and frayed under relentless heat, sand lodged in mechanisms, and bolts occasionally misfired. Soldiers developed practical adaptations: lightly greased bowstrings to prevent drying, protective wrappings for trigger mechanisms, and careful wiping of sand from grooves before firing. Even such small adjustments could determine the difference between a shot that struck true and one that misfired at a critical moment. Swords, the quintessential weapon of knights, faced a different set of challenges. The heat of the desert sun warmed steel to an uncomfortable degree, increasing the risk of burns on hands or wrists through gauntlets. Sand, fine and pervasive, infiltrated leather grips and scabbards, causing abrasion, dulling edges, and occasionally jamming quick-draw movements. Soldiers adapted by wrapping cloth around grips, lining scabbards with soft material, and carrying sharpening stones to maintain edge integrity during extended campaigns. Each routine task, small, repetitive, and painstaking, was essential for functional weaponry. Even armor affected how weapons were used in the desert. Chainmail and plate offered protection from blades and arrows, but increased the weight and restricted movement, which in turn affected swing speed, reaction times, and accuracy with swords or maces. Crossbowmen had to carefully balance stability and mobility, often kneeling or bracing against sandbanks to maintain a consistent aim. Long, sustained engagements became as much about conserving energy and maintaining equipment as they were about skill or precision in combat. Environmental conditions imposed subtle but significant constraints on daily combat readiness. Wind-blown sand reduced visibility, dulled hearing, and caused irritation to eyes and skin. Soldiers adjusted firing positions to shield against sand and used improvisations such as cloth face coverings or modified helmets. Even minor changes in body posture or stance had to account for the shifting terrain, both to maintain balance and to avoid destabilizing heavy equipment. In this way, every skirmish became a negotiation between human physiology, weapon functionality, and environmental pressures. Maintenance routines for weaponry became embedded into the soldiers' daily lives. Crossbow strings were inspected for fraying each morning, bolts checked for straightness, and swords wiped clean of sand and sweat. Leather straps and grips were oiled or wrapped for protection, and sharpening was performed during brief pauses in marches or in the evening under lantern light. While these activities lacked drama, they were crucial. A mismanaged crossbow string or a dulled sword could render even the most skilled warrior ineffective. Logistics further complicated weapon use. Heavy weapons had to be carried alongside armor, supplies, and personal belongings, often on camels or on soldiers' own backs. Rapid access was limited by sand, heat, and the weight of equipment. Soldiers devised systems for organization, bolts and arrows in protective containers, swords secured to prevent shifting, and tools for maintenance easily reachable. These adaptations, largely invisible in official chronicles, determined the army's operational effectiveness as much as battlefield skill. Psychological adaptation was equally important. Soldiers quickly realized that standard European expectations of combat performance were unrealistic in desert conditions. Frustration with equipment failures, fatigue, and environmental discomfort could lead to mistakes. By adjusting expectations, packing exertion, and prioritizing maintenance and hydration, soldiers preserved both skill and morale. Survival depended not just on weaponry, but on the disciplined application of knowledge gained through experience. Early skirmishes with local forces exposed the limits of European weapons. Crossbowmen found that sand and heat diminished firing speed, accuracy, and range. Swordsmanship became laborious as armor heated, weight slowed movements, and sand irritated skin. Maces and axes, while effective against armored opponents, required more exertion than anticipated, leading to faster fatigue. Soldiers adapted with patience and ingenuity, alternating weapon use, resting strategically, and leveraging environmental features for tactical advantage. By the end of the first week, a clear understanding emerged among the soldiers. Weapons alone did not ensure success. Survival, endurance, and adaptation to environmental constraints were equally decisive. Every adjustment, from greasing a bowstring to lining a scabbard, represented a small victory in maintaining combat readiness under harsh conditions. The desert demanded not only courage and skill, but also careful observation, discipline, and practical problem-solving. As night falls and the desert cools slightly, soldiers clean and inspect weapons, repair minor damage, and prepare for the next day. Camels rest, and armor is carefully adjusted for sleep without compromising readiness. In these quiet routines, you see the invisible labor that allows armies to function under extreme conditions. The effectiveness of weapons, so celebrated in chronicles, relies heavily on countless mundane acts of maintenance and adaptation. A lingering question remains. If victory in Europe often depended on weapon skill and armor, how many campaigns in extreme climates were truly determined by ingenuity, discipline, and the patient, repetitive care of men and equipment, rather than the weapons themselves? The answer, hidden in the dust and sweat of desert campaigns, may reshape the way we think about medieval warfare entirely. By the second week of operations in the desert, European soldiers have begun to internalize the subtle lessons imposed by sand, heat, and armor. Every movement is measured, every adjustment considered, and every tool maintained. Weapons, once assumed to function flawlessly in battle, now demand constant attention. Crossbow strings stretch or fray with heat, bolts collect grit that slows mechanisms, and metal swords expand in the sun, causing scabbards to bind. Soldiers respond with patience, improvisation, and repetitive maintenance actions that are largely invisible in historical records, but vital for survival and effectiveness. Combat itself has shifted under these conditions. The open, predictable battlefields of Europe are replaced by undulating dunes and sand-choked visibility. Traditional formations lose some of their value. Heavy cavalry struggles on loose sand, infantry must adjust footing, and archers contend with shifting trajectories caused by wind. Soldiers who maintain their weapons meticulously perform better not because of raw skill, but because their equipment continues to function reliably under stress. Small innovations, wrapping crossbow strings, lining scabbards, or adjusting grips for heat expansion, directly impact combat outcomes. Armor interacts with weapons and environment in unexpected ways. Helmets, while essential for protection against enemy projectiles and debris, trap heat and restrict airflow, reducing reaction speed and stamina. Chainmail, effective against slashing attacks, adds weight that accelerates fatigue during prolonged marches or labor-intensive skirmishes. Swords, axes, and maces are slowed by both heat stress and sand abrasion, requiring more exertion to achieve the same effect. Soldiers develop compensatory strategies, alternating weapon use, taking micro-rests to prevent exhaustion, and using environmental features such as dunes or rocks to reduce exertion while maintaining defensive positions. Crossbowmen face particular challenges. Reloading mechanisms, typically efficient in temperate climates, are hampered by grit and heat. Bolts misfire when sand accumulates in grooves, and strings stretched by sun demand careful readjustment. Soldiers create improvisations to mitigate these issues. Cloth wraps for strings, sand shields around firing platforms, and pre-cleaned bolts for rapid use. While these adjustments are mundane, they preserve operational capacity, allowing soldiers to maintain pressure on defenders or engage in skirmishes without catastrophic failure. Psychological endurance becomes a critical factor. Repetitive, exhausting labor combined with constant attention to weapons and armor taxes concentration. Soldiers learn to focus on small victories, maintaining a functional crossbow for the day, keeping a sword free of sand, or successfully completing a minor skirmish without injury. These repetitive, boring tasks form a foundation of resilience, enabling men to continue functioning under harsh conditions. The desert transforms warfare into an exercise in patience, observation, and controlled effort. Food and hydration remain tightly intertwined with weapon effectiveness. A soldier's ability to swing a sword or reload a crossbow is directly influenced by water intake and caloric energy. Heat and exertion accelerate fatigue. Even a minor lapse in rationing or hydration can render a man ineffective in combat. Soldiers coordinate with officers and supply personnel to ensure proper distribution of water and food, carefully balancing energy needs against available supplies. The interplay between logistics, weapons, and human endurance illustrates the complex dependencies that define desert campaigns. Minor innovations proliferate organically among soldiers. Helmets are lined with damp cloth for ventilation. Chainmail is loosened during labor but tightened for skirmishes, and crossbowmen develop standardized routines for cleaning and lubricating their mechanisms between shots. Experienced soldiers teach newcomers these techniques, creating informal knowledge networks that preserve effectiveness. In many cases, these uncelebrated adaptations determine outcomes more than formal strategy or direct combat skill. Skirmishes with local forces highlight the limitations of European weaponry. Crossbows fire accurately only when meticulously maintained. Swords require more effort to swing effectively under the sun. And maces, though potent against armor, demand energy that fatigued men cannot always sustain. Soldiers who have internalized adaptation strategies managing hydration, packing exertion, and maintaining equipment perform far better than those relying solely on technique. The environment dictates effectiveness, not tradition or perceived superiority of weaponry. Even the simplest tasks, adjusting armor straps, cleaning sand from a blade, retensioning a crossbow string, take on heightened significance. These mundane efforts ensure that men are not incapacitated by their own equipment or environmental conditions. The desert's influence on medieval weaponry is clear. Without continuous attention, even the finest steel, carefully forged and sharpened, becomes a liability rather than an asset. By the end of the second week, an emerging pattern is evident. Mastery of weaponry in the desert is inseparable from endurance, adaptation, and environmental awareness. Combat success is determined less by heroism or skill alone, and more by the cumulative effect of meticulous maintenance, careful packing, and subtle innovation. The desert does not reward haste or arrogance. It rewards diligence, observation, and quiet, repeated attention to detail. As night falls, soldiers clean their weapons, adjust armor, and review the day's minor successes and failures. Camels rest, water is rationed, and minor repairs are made to ensure readiness for the next day. In these repetitive routines lies the invisible backbone of military effectiveness: survival, adaptation, and the quiet management of equipment. The question lingers: In campaigns conducted under extreme environmental pressures, how much of the historical record reflects combat skill, and how much reflects the patient, meticulous labor that allowed weapons and men to function at all? By the third week, the desert has imposed its quiet, relentless lessons on the army. Soldiers have learned that survival and combat effectiveness in this environment rely as much on careful adaptation and maintenance as on the sharpness of a sword or the tension of a crossbow string. Each piece of equipment, from chainmail to crossbow bolts, bears the marks of laborious attention: scratches from sand, heat-induced warping, and minor repairs performed under lantern light. These uncelebrated details, repeated day after day, have become the invisible framework that sustains the army. The first major engagement with local forces demonstrates the cumulative impact of adaptation. Crossbowmen who have maintained their strings and shields perform reliably, their bolts striking true despite sand and wind. Infantry wielding swords and maces act with surprising endurance, moving deliberately to conserve energy while still delivering effective strikes. Soldiers who neglected maintenance, hydration, or environmental adaptation falter quickly, demonstrating that raw skill or valor alone is insufficient when the desert intervenes. Victory emerges not from heroic feats, but from disciplined preparation and careful attention to the mundane aspects of equipment and endurance. Armor continues to play its dual role. Helmets protect heads from projectiles and debris, but trap heat, necessitating careful ventilation strategies. Chainmail guards against slashing attacks, yet adds weight that accelerates fatigue during long marches or extended combat. Soldiers have adapted through incremental adjustments, loosening greaves during labor-intensive tasks, lining helmets with cloth to improve airflow, and alternating weapons to manage energy expenditure. These small adaptations, invisible in conventional chronicles, determine whether a man reaches the battle fully functional or collapses from exhaustion. Crossbows, swords, and maces all perform within the limits of their adaptations. Bolts hit targets reliably, provided mechanisms are clean and strings properly tensioned. Swords maintain their edge when regularly wiped of sand and sharpened during downtime. Maces deliver force efficiently when wielded by soldiers who have preserved stamina through careful packing. Combat effectiveness is thus inseparable from ongoing maintenance, hydration, and tactical patience. The desert transforms the application of weaponry into an exercise in endurance, observation, and repeated labor, rather than pure skill or bravery. Logistics and environmental mastery are equally critical. Water rations are monitored, food consumed strategically, and camels maintained to ensure consistent supply. Even minor disruptions, overloaded animals, mismanaged rations, or improperly secured equipment can cascade into critical failures. Soldiers who internalize these routines perform far more effectively in combat than those relying solely on skill or courage. In essence, survival itself becomes a weapon, honed through careful observation, repetition, and practical ingenuity. By the conclusion of the engagement, it becomes evident that medieval weaponry alone was insufficient to guarantee success in extreme climates. Armor, swords, and crossbows functioned optimally only when paired with endurance, adaptation, and diligent maintenance. The desert, impartial and unyielding, tested not only skill but discipline, patience, and the quiet labor that ensures operational readiness under continuous stress. Soldiers' survival, and thus the campaign's outcome, relied on these unrecorded acts of attention to detail as much as on combat prowess. The broader historical lesson is striking. While chronicles emphasize battles won, heroic knights, and the elegance of weaponry, much of what determined success remains invisible. Meticulous maintenance of gear, strategic rationing of water and food, packing of labor, and incremental adaptations to extreme conditions. These elements, repeated over days and weeks, create the foundation upon which apparent victories rest. Without them, even the finest arms would fail, and even the bravest soldiers would falter. As the sun sets and soldiers remove armor for inspection, the scene is one of quiet reflection rather than triumphal spectacle. Each dent, scratch, and repaired strap tells a story of adaptation and perseverance. Crossbow strings, blades, and maces bear the marks of labor that ensured functionality, and the Army's survival is owed as much to these unseen efforts as to any battle plan or heroic strike. The desert has revealed a subtle truth. Success in extreme environments depends less on equipment or skill and more on the disciplined, patient execution of small, repetitive tasks that preserve life and readiness. And so, a lingering thought remains. If victories are recorded in chronicles, how many of them were truly the result of strategic brilliance, and how many depended on the invisible, painstaking care, discipline, and endurance of men maintaining weapons, armor, and themselves under the relentless desert sun? The desert leaves this question unanswered, a quiet reminder that history is often shaped as much by perseverance as by heroism. Story 6. Desert Marches and Armor Fatigue. Marching through the desert is an exercise in endurance, patience, and constant adjustment. For medieval soldiers accustomed to temperate climates, the experience is unrelenting. Every dune, every grain of sand, and every hour of sunlight imposes physical and mental strain. Armor, designed to protect in battle, becomes a weighty companion that both shields and hinders. Each piece chainmail, helmet, greaves, and gauntlets presses against the body, trapping heat and limiting mobility. Soldiers quickly learn that survival depends less on courage and more on small, deliberate adaptations to the harsh conditions. The first challenge is the unyielding heat. Sunlight radiates from sand and rocks, warming armor to the point that metal becomes almost uncomfortable to touch. Helmets trap this heat, forcing soldiers to develop ventilation techniques, lining helmets with cloth, creating small air gaps, or loosening padding temporarily during marches. Chainmail, while effective against enemy strikes, becomes abrasive when combined with sweat and sand. Soldiers apply oils or cloth padding to prevent chafing and blisters, often stopping multiple times a day to adjust straps, tighten buckles, and shift weight for comfort. Each adjustment, though repetitive and mundane, ensures that soldiers can continue marching rather than succumbing to fatigue or injury. Sand infiltrates every crevice. It slips under armor plates, collects in chainmail rings, and settles in the folds of leather straps. Soldiers spend hours brushing, adjusting, and wiping, often under the glare of the sun or the blowing wind of minor sandstorms. Helmets and gloves are cleaned with cloths or small brushes, while shoes are emptied of sand regularly to prevent abrasions. Even minor neglect leads to discomfort, slow movements, or injuries that accumulate over days of marching. The desert transforms seemingly simple routines into essential survival measures. Fatigue accumulates quickly, especially when combined with the weight of armor. Knights and infantry alike discover that the long marches drain stamina far more rapidly than combat in familiar environments. Soldiers pace themselves, alternating between heavier exertion during relatively firm terrain and slower, cautious movement across loose sand. Officers coordinate brief resting intervals, often in the shade of dunes, tents, or natural outcroppings. These micro-rests, seemingly trivial, allow muscles to recover, preventing collapse and preserving readiness for both labor and combat. Hydration is a constant concern. Leather flasks and camel-borne water are rationed meticulously, with each sip calculated against remaining distance, exertion level, and environmental conditions. Soldiers monitor not only their own needs, but also those of their comrades, ensuring that units maintain operational capacity without overtaxing limited resources. Camels, while resilient, also require monitoring. A fatigued or dehydrated camel slows the entire column and jeopardizes the distribution of essential supplies. Even small adjustments in marching order or packing can prevent cascading failures that would compromise survival. Armor fatigue manifests in ways beyond physical exhaustion. Leather straps stretch, buckles loosen, and chainmail rings begin to wear under constant movement. Helmets warp slightly from heat and repeated adjustments. Soldiers learn to anticipate these minor failures, carrying small tools, spare straps, and oil for leather conditioning. Daily inspection routines become critical. A neglected buckle or frayed strap can result in injury or loss of mobility at a moment when speed or protection is essential. The desert, impartial and constant, punishes oversight and rewards meticulous attention. The psychological strain is equally pervasive. Repetitive labor, unrelenting sun, and limited water contribute to mental fatigue. Soldiers cope through routines, inspecting armor at the same time each day, coordinating small tasks with comrades, and packing exertion carefully. Informal communication, such as sharing advice on adjusting padding or balancing loads, circulates quietly through the ranks. These small interactions build resilience and maintain morale, illustrating that survival in the desert depends not just on physical strength, but also on discipline, observation, and cooperation. Camels, tents, and equipment all interact with armor fatigue. Heavier loads placed on camels necessitate more exertion from soldiers when loading, unloading, or stabilizing cargo. Sand shifts unpredictably, forcing adjustments in stance, balance, and gait. Each step becomes a negotiation between protecting oneself from environmental hazards and conserving energy for the long march ahead. Minor errors, misjudging a dune's firmness, neglecting to adjust a strap, or allowing sand to accumulate compound over hours, creating cumulative fatigue that is invisible to observers but devastating in its effects. Even at night, soldiers' attention to armor and equipment continues. Chains are inspected, straps tightened, helmets cleaned, and boots cleared of sand. These routines, repeated quietly in the darkness, ensure readiness for the next day's march and skirmishes. While invisible in official chronicles, such diligence forms the backbone of survival. Soldiers quickly realize that endurance, not heroism, dictates the pace and outcome of desert campaigns. By the end of the first week, a subtle tension emerges. The desert march is not merely a prelude to combat but a continuous test of human limits. Each adjustment, each micro-rest, each careful ration of water or food accumulates into a measure of collective endurance. The Army's success, you begin to see, depends on the meticulous repetition of small, almost boring acts. Attention to armor, packing, hydration, and observation that together determine survival in a landscape designed to test persistence at every step. As the sun dips below the horizon and the temperature drops slightly, soldiers remove armor for inspection and minor repairs. Sand is brushed away, straps readjusted, and chainmail checked for weakened links. Camels rest, tents are secured, and water containers replenished for the next day. In these quiet routines lies the invisible labor of endurance, the slow, repetitive, unrecorded work that enables armies to function under extreme conditions. A lingering question remains. How many historical campaigns, celebrated for victories or tactical brilliance, were in fact determined by the quiet, patient mastery of survival, armor care, and environmental adaptation that rarely appears in chronicles? The desert offers no answers, only relentless tests of endurance and discipline, leaving men to discover the limits of their own resilience. By the second week, the desert has become both adversary and teacher. Soldiers move with an ingrained rhythm, adjusting every step for loose sand, shifting dunes, and the added weight of armor that seems heavier with each passing day. Chainmail, once a symbol of invincibility, now presses against skin sore from friction. Helmets trap heat, grease, and padding mixed with sweat to form uncomfortable layers, forcing soldiers to readjust constantly. Fatigue accumulates imperceptibly, creating a slow erosion of strength, reflexes, and morale, even among the most disciplined troops. The weight of armor is not the only burden. Every strap, buckle, and joint must be inspected repeatedly. Leather wears and cracks under the sun, metal plates warp or scratch, and chainmail loosens in ways that compromise both protection and mobility. Soldiers develop meticulous routines, tightening buckles, oiling leather, shifting padding to avoid chafing, and cleaning metal links of embedded sand. Each adjustment, while monotonous, is essential for maintaining functionality and preventing injuries. Without these incremental interventions, even a seasoned knight risks incapacitation before reaching the battlefield. Camels, as the primary carriers of equipment and supplies, require careful oversight. Soldiers monitor each animal's gait, hydration, and load balance. An overburdened camel cannot maintain pace, forcing soldiers to exert extra energy to stabilize cargo or adjust pack placement. Missteps are costly. An animal stumbling in loose sand could scatter essential equipment, leaving soldiers vulnerable and slowing the entire column. The desert emphasizes that human endurance is inseparable from the care of animals, whose fatigue directly affects operational capability. Water, the most precious resource, dictates pace and behavior. Each day, soldiers calculate rations carefully, balancing immediate hydration against expected exertion and distance to the next source. Overconsumption accelerates depletion. Underconsumption risks heat exhaustion, impaired judgment, and reduced combat readiness. Officers supervise distribution meticulously, while experienced soldiers coach their comrades on observing subtle signs of dehydration in both men and animals. The desert enforces vigilance, revealing that even small lapses can have cascading consequences. Fatigue is compounded by environmental hazards. Sandstorms, though infrequent, impose abrupt disruptions. Vision is reduced to a few meters, wind shifts footing, and grit infiltrates armor, weapons, and skin. Soldiers stop to clear debris from chainmail, helmets, and weapons, a repetitive labor that is exhausting yet essential for survival. Minor oversights, unnoticed sand under a helmet, loose strap, or grit in a joint can compromise mobility or protection during sudden combat or while traversing treacherous terrain. Survival is a function of patience, precision, and the quiet execution of repetitive tasks. The psychological strain of continuous exertion becomes apparent. Monotony, heat, and sand wear down morale, and soldiers rely on routines and social cohesion to maintain focus. Sharing water, adjusting armor for a comrade, or offering advice on camel handling fosters both survival and resilience. These informal systems of support, often invisible to commanders or chroniclers, sustain effectiveness under conditions that would otherwise degrade physical and mental capacity. The desert transforms operational planning. Marching distances are calculated based on terrain firmness, water availability, and anticipated weather. Armor and weapon management becomes a daily labor-intensive cycle rather than a preparatory task for combat. Soldiers adjust their exertion to conserve energy for the next day, the next climb over a dune, or the next minor skirmish. The environment itself dictates strategy. Armies move not when convenient, but when feasible, and progress is measured as much in survival as in miles covered. Even minor details affect the broader campaign. The angle of a helmet, the balance of a pack, the way a sword is carried, and the placement of a camel load all influence endurance and performance. Soldiers who internalize these details operate more effectively, moving steadily despite exhaustion, heat, and sand. Those who neglect them falter quickly, demonstrating that survival is a cumulative product of countless small, repetitive adaptations. Armor and weapons are necessary but insufficient. Endurance and attention to minutiae determine outcomes. By the end of the second week, a subtle but undeniable lesson has emerged. The desert does not reward raw strength or courage alone. Success depends on sustained, disciplined attention to the interplay between body, armor, equipment, and environment. Soldiers who master these routines, packing themselves, maintaining gear, observing animals, and managing hydration, function at a higher level than those who rely solely on traditional notions of valor or skill. The Army's effectiveness, in essence, is inseparable from its ability to endure the repetitive, monotonous demands of the desert. As night falls, soldiers once again remove armor for inspection, clean sand from chainmail, adjust straps, and oil leather. Camels are fed and checked for injuries, water containers refilled, and equipment repaired for the next day's exertions. These quiet, repetitive routines, though unremarkable in any chronicle, form the backbone of survival, illustrating that endurance is built on patience, observation, and diligence. A question lingers as the desert night settles. In campaigns so dominated by fatigue, environment, and logistical precision, how much of history's recorded victories are owed to these quiet, repeated acts of maintenance and adaptation, rather than the visible heroics of battle? The desert itself offers no answer, only the unrelenting test of human limits. By the third week of the march, the desert has revealed its unforgiving demands. Soldiers have been reshaped physically, mentally, and emotionally by constant exertion, armor fatigue, and environmental pressures. What began as a column of disciplined but untested men has become a cohort defined as much by endurance as by skill. Every chainmail link, strapped plate, and sand-worn leather piece tells the story of survival and adaptation. Armor, once a symbol of protection and martial prowess, has become a tool that must be managed, maintained, and constantly adjusted to preserve life and functionality. Fatigue, accumulated over days of marching, has forced soldiers to reconsider the very meaning of combat readiness. Helmets are ventilated with cloth, greaves loosened during labor-intensive movements, and swords cleaned and oiled with precision to ensure swift deployment. Soldiers who fail to adapt, who allow straps to loosen or sand to accumulate, quickly reveal their vulnerability, not necessarily to enemy attack, but to the environment itself. Survival and effectiveness are inseparable from careful attention to these mundane, repetitive tasks. Camels continue to play an indispensable role. Each animal, carefully tended, carries not only supplies but the potential to sustain life for the soldiers it serves. Observing fatigue in camels becomes as critical as monitoring hydration and strength in men. Mismanagement of a single pack animal can disrupt the entire column, highlighting how human endurance is intimately linked with the health and stability of logistical support. The desert enforces constant awareness, revealing that successful campaigns are rarely the product of combat skill alone. Water rationing, meal management, and packing have become second nature. Soldiers now coordinate movement with precise knowledge of exertion, hydration, and terrain, ensuring that energy is preserved for critical moments. These adjustments, repeated daily, transform the march into a system of endurance that balances environmental constraints with human capabilities. Even minor deviations, a miscalculated sip of water, a poorly balanced pack, or a neglected piece of armor can result in cumulative failure. The desert, impartial and consistent, amplifies every small oversight into meaningful consequences. By the time the army reaches its first strategic objective, a fortified position, controlling a critical route, the impact of these routines is evident. Soldiers who have maintained their armor, managed hydration, and adapted movement perform far better than those relying solely on traditional training or physical strength. Combat, when it occurs, is conducted by men whose capacity to endure has been honed through repetitive, quiet labor rather than moments of heroism. The Army's success is a testament to preparation, observation, and persistent adaptation, rather than the sudden drama of battle. The Desert March illustrates a subtle truth of history. Many victories, campaigns, and survival narratives are less about strategy or bravery, and more about the repeated, unglamorous tasks that preserve life and readiness. Soldiers, attention to armor, hydration, packing, and logistical care may appear mundane, but these small acts cumulatively decide whether an army arrives capable of engagement or collapses under the environment's relentless pressure. Armor, weapons, and courage are essential, but their effectiveness depends entirely on continuous care and adaptation. Even at night, the work continues. Armor is inspected and repaired, chainmail brushed free of sand, leather conditioned and helmets adjusted for the next day. Camels are fed, water containers refilled, and loads reorganized. These acts, repeated endlessly, sustain both men and animals, forming the invisible foundation of operational capability. The desert transforms routine into survival skill, and mundane diligence becomes as heroic as any battlefield feat. By the march's end, one observation is unavoidable. Human resilience is as much a product of patience, repetition, and adaptation as of physical strength or courage. Soldiers survive because they have learned to manage fatigue, maintain armor, and negotiate environmental hazards with discipline. The desert rewards diligence, observation, and incremental problem-solving over traditional notions of valor or brute force. Armor and weapons matter only insofar as they are maintained and adapted to the environment. Survival and operational success depend on these invisible, painstaking routines. A lingering thought remains. How many medieval campaigns, recorded as triumphs of strategy or heroism, were in reality determined by soldiers' patient attention to armor, hydration, and movement, the quiet, repetitive acts that allowed men to endure the desert's unyielding demands. The desert leaves no trace of these efforts in chronicles, yet they may have shaped history more profoundly than any battle itself. Story 7: Nights Under the Sun, Fatigue and Fortitude. When you picture a medieval night, you likely imagine movement, a charge, a clash of steel, a moment of decisive action. Yet in desert campaigns, the defining experience of knighthood is not motion but endurance. Hours pass without combat. Days stretch into weeks beneath an unbroken sky. The sun becomes the most constant presence, rising without mercy, setting without relief, and returning again to test the limits of human fortitude. For knights accustomed to the rhythms of northern Europe, cool mornings, damp fields, and shaded forests, the desert sun is an unfamiliar authority. It dictates when you rise, how fast you move, how long you rest, and how much strength you can preserve. Armor, forged to protect against blades and arrows, becomes an intermediary between your body and this relentless heat. Steel absorbs sunlight efficiently. By mid-morning, breastplates are warm to the touch. By noon, they radiate heat inward, pressing against linen padding soaked with sweat. Helmets are the most oppressive. Airflow is minimal, and even well-designed visors trap warmth. Breathing becomes shallow and deliberate, not from panic, but from conservation. Every unnecessary movement increases heat buildup. Knights learn to keep their heads slightly angled when marching, allowing what little air circulates to escape upward. Cloth liners are adjusted repeatedly, shifted millimeter by millimeter to reduce friction and improve comfort. These are not acts of impatience, but of survival. Fatigue arrives gradually. It does not announce itself. It seeps in through the joints, the neck, the small muscles of the back that stabilize armor weight. The first signs are subtle, slower reactions, slightly imprecise steps, a reluctance to tighten a strap that should be tightened. Left unchecked, these small lapses compound. A knight who neglects to rest when permitted may still stand upright, still walk, still follow orders, but his capacity to respond decisively has already begun to erode. Marching formations reflect this reality. Knights rarely march in full armor when combat is not imminent. Greaves are loosened. Gauntlets are removed and carried. Shields are slung rather than held. Yet even partial armor weighs heavily. A knight's physical conditioning, built through years of training, is tested not by combat but by sustained exposure. Muscles developed for explosive strength are now required to support static weight for hours at a time. Water discipline becomes a defining habit. Knights, despite their status, drink no more than common infantry. Leather flasks are checked repeatedly. Sips are measured not for thirst but for necessity. You learn to tolerate dryness in the mouth, heat behind the eyes, and the dull ache of dehydration as long as cognition remains intact. Veterans recognize the danger signs: dizziness, confusion, unsteady balance. Younger knights learn by observation, adjusting behavior long before collapse becomes visible. The psychological toll is quieter but no less significant. The sun removes variety from the landscape. Color fades into shades of beige and pale stone. Days become difficult to distinguish from one another. Armor maintenance, once an occasional duty, becomes a daily ritual that anchors the mind. Cleaning sand from mail links, wiping sweat from steel, checking rivets and straps, these repetitive actions impose structure where the environment offers none. Fortitude in this context is not defiance. It is acceptance paired with discipline. Knights learn not to fight the sun but to work within its limits. Movement slows. Speech becomes sparse. Orders are concise. Even pride adapts. There is little room for flamboyance in the desert. Status is expressed through reliability rather than display. A knight who remains steady at midday heat earns respect more than one who boasts of strength. Even rest offers limited comfort. Shade is scarce and often shared. Armor is loosened but not removed entirely, lest sudden movement be required. Sleep comes lightly, interrupted by heat retained in metal and the constant presence of sand. You wake already tired, already warm, already aware that endurance, not action, will define the day ahead. As days pass, a subtle transformation occurs. Knights stop measuring themselves against ideals formed in colder lands. They begin measuring success differently. Did you arrive with strength remaining? Did your armor remain functional? Did you avoid injury born of fatigue rather than combat? These questions quietly replace older definitions of martial excellence. And yet, beneath the routines and adjustments, one uncertainty persists. If fatigue alone can reshape knighthood so completely, if endurance under the sun determines readiness more than skill with weapons, what happens when combat finally arrives? And the limits tested by heat must also withstand fear and violence at the same time. As the days lengthen under the desert sun, fatigue settles into the body in layers. It is no longer sharp or surprising. It becomes familiar, almost predictable, shaping how you move, think, and respond. Knights who once gauged readiness by strength or speed now evaluate themselves by subtler measures: steadiness of breath, clarity of thought, and the absence of small tremors in the hands when tightening straps or lifting a helm. Armor maintenance becomes inseparable from personal survival. Chainmail, warmed by the sun and stiffened by dried sweat, must be loosened and reset multiple times each day. If left untouched, it rubs skin raw beneath padded garments, creating sores that fester quickly in heat. Knights learn to inspect their bodies as carefully as their equipment, noting redness, swelling, or tenderness long before injury becomes disabling. This vigilance is not vanity, it is necessity. A wounded knight from chafing or heat exhaustion is as lost to the campaign as one struck down in battle. Helmets are adjusted almost continuously. Padding is shifted to allow minimal airflow, visors raised when possible, lowered only when dust or threat demands it. Knights become adept at reading the environment, the angle of the sun, the direction of the wind, the feel of heat against the neck. These cues dictate posture and movement more reliably than commands. A slight tilt of the head can reduce heat buildup. A slower pace can preserve strength without drawing attention. The desert enforces humility. Rank offers little protection against exhaustion. Noble birth does not reduce water requirements, nor does fine armor lighten itself. Knights accustomed to command learn restraint, recognizing that overexertion sets a poor example. Leadership under the sun becomes quiet and observational. A knight who slows the pace slightly, who signals a rest without dramatics, preserves the unit more effectively than one who demands endurance through force of will alone. Combat readiness takes on a new meaning. Training in Europe emphasizes bursts of effort, the charge, the clash, the decisive moment. In the desert, readiness is sustained restraint. Knights conserve energy not because they fear combat, but because combat may arrive after days of exposure. Muscles already taxed by heat cannot be relied upon for sudden exertion unless carefully preserved. Every unnecessary movement is avoided. Even gestures are minimized. Horses, where present, reflect the same strain. Knights dismount frequently, sparing animals during the hottest hours. Saddles are adjusted to prevent sores, hooves checked for damage from hot sand and stone. A knight separated from his horse by fatigue or injury is reduced in mobility and status, yet this reality is accepted without protest. The desert equalizes. Survival outweighs pride. Psychological fatigue deepens alongside the physical. The monotony of the landscape dulls the senses. Without variation, time stretches unnaturally. Knights mark days not by dates but by routines. The number of inspections completed, the condition of their armor, the state of their water supply. Conversation becomes sparse, not from tension but from conservation of effort. Silence is efficient. Small rituals take on disproportionate importance. Cleaning armor at dusk, tightening straps before sleep, checking weapons even when no engagement is expected, these actions restore a sense of control. They remind you that while the environment cannot be mastered, it can be negotiated. Discipline becomes the true expression of fortitude, not bravado or defiance. The sun's effect on judgment is subtle but dangerous. Heat dulls reaction times and clouds decision-making. Experienced knights learn to question themselves when conditions worsen. If irritation rises too quickly, if impatience surfaces without cause, it is treated as a symptom rather than a flaw. Orders are double-checked. Decisions are delayed when possible. In this way, discipline becomes collective protection against individual weakness. Armor, paradoxically, both causes and mitigates fatigue. It traps heat and adds weight, yet it also enforces posture and restraint. A knight encased in steel cannot move impulsively. Each action requires intention. Over time, this enforced deliberation aligns with the desert's demands. The armor shapes behavior as much as it shields the body. As the army approaches areas of greater strategic importance, tension increases. Scouts report possible encounters. Knights begin wearing fuller armor for longer periods, testing endurance under heightened stress. The balance becomes precarious. Too much preparation drains strength. Too little risks vulnerability. Decisions are made cautiously, informed by weeks of observation rather than instinct. At night, when temperatures drop, fatigue does not vanish. It lingers in the muscles and joints, a reminder of cumulative strain. Sleep is shallow. Armor rests nearby, never fully out of reach. Knights wake already tired, already calculating how much energy can be spared for the coming day. The cycle continues, steady and unbroken. And beneath it all, an unspoken concern persists. If the desert can reshape discipline, redefine readiness, and reduce even the most seasoned knights to careful conservators of energy, what happens when battle finally arrives? And fatigue must coexist with fear, noise, and sudden violence under the same relentless sun. When battle finally comes, it does not arrive with drama equal to its anticipation. There is no sudden transformation from exhaustion to heroism. Instead, combat emerges as another demand layered atop fatigue, heat, and restraint. Knights do not surge forward with explosive force. They move carefully, deliberately, aware that their bodies have limits shaped by weeks under the sun. Armor feels heavier than it ever did in training. Helmets, already warm, quickly become stifling once movement accelerates. Breathing must be controlled, not from fear but from necessity. Knights learn to fight in measured intervals, advance, engage, withdraw slightly, recover. Each motion is calculated to preserve balance and prevent overheating. Victory, if achieved, is the result of sustained functionality rather than sudden brilliance. Fatigue alters combat behavior in subtle ways. Blows are fewer but more precise. Shields are held closer to the body. Knights rely more on positioning than force, more on timing than speed. The desert has trained them well for this moment, though not intentionally. Weeks of restraint have refined efficiency. Energy wasted earlier would now be sorely missed. Those who ignored the lessons of endurance struggle visibly. Knights who march too aggressively, who dismissed maintenance or hydration, tire quickly. Their movements slow. Their judgment falters. In contrast, those who accepted the desert's discipline, who treated fatigue as a constant companion rather than an obstacle, remain effective longer. Survival, even in combat, belongs to the prepared rather than the bold. The sun does not pause for battle. Heat continues to build, reflecting off armor and sand alike. Knights recognize the danger signs instantly: narrowing vision, heavy limbs, delayed reactions. When possible, they disengage briefly, adjust armor, take measured sips of water. These acts are not cowardice. They are survival strategies refined through experience. When the fighting ends, there is little celebration. Relief is muted, exhaustion dominant. Armor is removed slowly, carefully, as if each piece carries accumulated strain. Bruises, abrasions, and burns are assessed with the same seriousness as wounds inflicted by weapons. A knight who survives the battle but collapses from heat afterward is considered no less lost. In the days that follow, reflection replaces urgency. Knights understand that the desert has redefined fortitude. It is no longer about enduring pain in a single moment, but about managing weakness over time. Armor remains essential, but it is no longer romanticized. It is recognized as a tool that demands respect, maintenance, and constant negotiation with the environment. The broader lesson settles quietly. Medieval warfare, so often remembered through clashes and conquests, was frequently shaped by endurance rather than action. Knights under the sun learned that strength is finite, that discipline preserves more lives than bravado, and that survival itself is a form of success. These lessons rarely appear in chronicles, yet they shaped outcomes as surely as any battle plan. As night falls and the desert cools, armor rests beside tired bodies. The sun will rise again, indifferent and unchanging. Knights will stand, adjust their equipment, and continue not because they are fearless, but because they have learned how to endure. And so the final question lingers, quiet and unresolved. If fatigue and fortitude shape warriors so profoundly, how many moments in history attributed to courage or skill were, in truth, decided long before battle under the steady pressure of sun, sand, and the discipline to endure them? Story 8. Armor maintenance in harsh climates. When you think of medieval armor, it is easy to imagine it as static steel shaped once, worn many times and trusted without question. Yet armor in practice is never fixed. It changes constantly, responding to climate, environment, and the habits of the person who wears it. In harsh climates, especially arid and sandy regions, armor maintenance becomes one of the most important daily activities a soldier or knight performs, even though it rarely receives attention in historical accounts. In temperate Europe, armor maintenance follows a familiar rhythm. Moisture is the primary enemy: rust, mildew, and rot. Oil is applied regularly. Armor is wiped clean after rain. Leather is dried slowly to prevent cracking. These habits carry over into desert campaigns, but they must be adapted. The desert presents a different threat. Instead of moisture, there is dryness so complete it draws oils out of leather and padding. Sand infiltrates everything. Fine grains work their way into mail links, hinge joints, and rivets, turning smooth movement into grinding resistance. From the moment a column enters arid terrain, armor begins to deteriorate in new ways. Chainmail stiffens as sand settles between interlocking rings. Plate armor creaks as hinges accumulate grit. Straps loosen as leather dries and shrinks, then stiffens unpredictably. None of this happens all at once. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, which makes it dangerous. Armor that appears serviceable in the morning may restrict movement or fail by afternoon if left unattended. For you, the wearer, maintenance becomes a form of constant vigilance. Each rest stop includes inspection. Fingers trace familiar surfaces, feeling for changes in texture. A hinge that once moved freely may now resist. A strap that lay flat yesterday may now curl or crack. These small signs guide immediate action. Delay is costly. Sand does not rest, it accumulates. Cleaning armor in the desert requires improvisation. Water is too precious to waste on washing steel. Instead, cloths are used to wipe surfaces repeatedly, removing dust before it settles deeply. Brushes, often simple bundles of stiff fibers, are employed to clean mail. Oil is applied sparingly, not to prevent rust, but to reduce friction and bind loose particles so they can be wiped away. Too much oil attracts more sand. Too little allows abrasion to continue unchecked. Balance is learned through experience. Leather presents its own challenges. In dry climates, it loses flexibility quickly. Belts, straps, and armor linings stiffen, increasing the risk of cracking or sudden failure. To counter this, soldiers rub leather with animal fat, wax, or specialized greases when available. These substances